The Last Campfire. The Last Campfire. The morning mist hung like gossamer threads between the towering Douglas firs as Emily Catherine Harris pressed her face against the cool passenger window of their rented Jeep Wrangler, watching the Canadian Rockies emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like ancient sentinels guarding secrets older than civilization itself. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced invisible patterns with her fingertip, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood that her new husband Jacob had already learned to recognize as a sign of her excitement mixed with apprehension. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed 5:47 a.m. in electric blue numbers, and they had been driving for nearly 3 hours through the winding mountain highways that snaked through some of the most pristine wilderness left in North America. "We're almost there, Em," Jacob Michael Harris said softly, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel as he navigated another hairpin turn that revealed a breathtaking vista of snow-capped peaks stretching endlessly toward the horizon. His voice carried the same mixture of anticipation and protective concern that had characterized their entire relationship, from their first meeting at the University of Colorado's outdoor recreation program 2 years earlier to their wedding just 6 days ago in her hometown of Boulder. At 28, Jacob was 3 years older than Emily, with the lean, weathered build of someone who had spent most of his adult life guiding adventure tours through some of the most challenging terrain in the American West. His dark hair was already showing premature streaks of silver at the temples, what Emily teasingly called his distinguished adventure guide look, and his green eyes held the kind of deep focus that came from years of reading weather patterns, animal tracks, and the subtle signs that separated a perfect outdoor experience from a potentially dangerous situation. Emily turned from the window and smiled at him, her auburn hair catching the first rays of sunlight that were beginning to filter through the forest canopy. At 25, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that seemed enhanced rather than diminished by the outdoor lifestyle she had embraced since meeting Jacob. Her fair skin kissed by countless hours of hiking and climbing, her blue eyes bright with the intelligence and curiosity that had made her such a successful environmental science graduate student. She reached over and placed her hand on his thigh, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence and the excitement of beginning their honeymoon adventure in one of the most spectacular wilderness areas on the continent. "I still can't believe we're actually here," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that made Jacob's heart swell with love for this woman who had changed his entire understanding of what it meant to share your life with someone. "Banff National Park. I've been dreaming about this place since I was a kid, reading about it in National Geographic." She pulled out her well-worn copy of the park's backcountry camping guide, its pages already marked with dozens of colored tabs and handwritten notes she had made during months of planning their honeymoon trip. Mystic Lake Campsite, elevation 7,200 feet, accessible only by the Cascade Trail, a moderate 8.2-mile hike through old-growth forest and alpine meadows, with pristine lake fishing and some of the best wildlife viewing opportunities in the park. Jacob chuckled at her enthusiasm, the sound warm and rich in the confines of their vehicle. "You've memorized that entire guidebook, haven't you? I swear you know more about this park than some of the rangers who work here." He glanced at her with obvious affection, remembering how she had spent countless evenings over the past 6 months researching every aspect of their planned adventure, from the optimal camping gear for high-altitude conditions to the feeding patterns of the various wildlife species they might encounter. Her attention to detail was one of the qualities that had first attracted him to her, the way she approached everything in her life with thorough preparation and genuine passion. "I just want everything to be perfect," Emily replied, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "This is our honeymoon, Jake. Our first big adventure as husband and wife. I know it sounds silly, But I feel like this trip is going to set the tone for our entire marriage. I want us to have memories that we'll be talking about when we're old and grey, sitting on our front porch in rocking chairs." She laughed at herself, but Jacob could hear the deeper significance this trip held for her, the way she viewed it as a symbolic beginning of their life together. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, and suddenly they found themselves driving through the stone gates that marked the entrance to Banff National Park, established in 1885 as Canada's first national park, and now encompassing over 2,500 square miles of some of the most spectacular mountain wilderness in the world. Jacob pulled into the visitor center parking lot, where a handful of other early rising adventurers were already preparing for their day's activities, their vehicles loaded with backpacks, tents, and the various gear necessary for extended wilderness camping. The visitor center itself was a beautiful log and stone structure that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape around it, designed to blend seamlessly with the mountain environment while providing modern facilities for the thousands of visitors who came to experience the park's wonders each year. Large windows offered panoramic views of the surrounding peaks, and informational displays covered everything from geological formations to wildlife safety protocols. Jacob and Emily gathered their documentation and headed inside, where they were greeted by Patricia "Patty" Donovan, a 34-year-old park ranger whose 12 years of experience in the Canadian wilderness had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of every trail, campsite, and potential hazard within the park's boundaries. Patty had started her career as a seasonal interpretive ranger straight out of college, drawn by her love of the outdoors and her desire to help others safely experience the incredible natural beauty of the Canadian Rockies. Over the years, she had worked her way up through various positions within Parks Canada, spending time as a backcountry patrol ranger, a wildlife management specialist, and eventually earning her current position as a senior resource conservation officer. Her experience included countless search and rescue operations, wildlife encounters, and emergency medical situations, giving her a deep respect for both the incredible beauty and the very real dangers that existed in the wilderness she called home. Standing just over 5.5 feet tall, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, Patty had the kind of confident, competent demeanor that immediately put visitors at ease, while also conveying the seriousness of wilderness travel. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but her hiking boots showed the wear of someone who spent as much time in the field as behind a desk. She greeted Jacob and Emily with a warm smile that reached her brown eyes, immediately sensing their excitement and the obvious love they shared. "Good morning, and welcome to Banff National Park," Patty said, reviewing their backcountry camping permits on her computer screen. "I see you're registered for Mystic Lake Campsite for the next 5 days. That's one of our most beautiful locations, and you've chosen a perfect time to visit. The weather forecast looks excellent, and the wildflowers should be at their peak right now." She pulled out a detailed topographic map of the area, spreading it across the counter between them. "Let me go over the route to your campsite and discuss some important safety information." Emily leaned forward eagerly, her guidebook open beside the map, as Patty traced their planned route with her finger. "You'll start here on the Cascade Trail, which begins about 2 miles north of the visitor center. The first 3 miles are relatively easy, following Cascade Creek through dense forest with a gradual elevation gain of about 800 feet. You'll cross the creek twice on wooden bridges that we rebuilt just last year, so they're in excellent condition. After the second bridge crossing, the trail starts to climb more steeply as you enter the transition zone between the montane and subalpine forest ecosystems." Jacob studied the map carefully, noting the contour lines that indicated the changing elevation and the various symbols that marked potential water sources, emergency shelters, and communication points. His years of guiding experience had taught him to pay close attention to these details, understanding that wilderness travel was all about preparation and having multiple backup plans for any situation that might arise. Around mile 5, Patty continued, you'll reach Cascade Meadows, which is absolutely stunning this time of year. The alpine wildflowers should be in full bloom, and it's a great place to take a break and refuel before the final push to the lake. The last 3 miles involve a steeper climb through subalpine forest and then a beautiful traverse along the ridge that gives you your first views of Mystic Lake itself. Emily practically glowed with anticipation as Patty described their route, already imagining the photos she would take and the experiences they would share. "What about wildlife?" she asked, her scientific training making her curious about the ecological aspects of their destination. "What should we expect to see?" Patty's expression became more serious as she shifted into her safety briefing mode. "This is prime habitat for a variety of large mammals, including elk, deer, moose, mountain goats, and both black bears and grizzly bears. We've had several bear sightings in the Mystic Lake area within the past 2 weeks, which is completely normal for this time of year. Early summer is when bears are most active, coming out of their winter dens and looking to build up their fat reserves after the lean winter months." She pulled out a laminated information sheet with detailed photos and descriptions of both black bears and grizzly bears. "It's crucial that you understand the difference between these 2 species and how to respond appropriately to an encounter with either one. Black bears are generally smaller, with pointed ears and a straight facial profile. They're usually black in color, but can also be brown or even cinnamon-colored, which sometimes causes confusion with grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are larger, with a distinctive shoulder hump, dished facial profile, and smaller, more rounded ears. Their fur can range from light brown to nearly black, but they're typically various shades of brown." Jacob nodded seriously, having encountered both species during his guiding career in Colorado and Montana. "What's the current bear activity level in the Mystic Lake area specifically?" he asked, wanting to understand the most up-to-date situation for their planned camping location. "We've documented 3 different bears in that general area over the past month," Patty replied, consulting her computer database of recent wildlife sightings and incidents. "2 black bears and 1 grizzly. The black bears appear to be a mother with a yearling cub and a solitary adult male. The grizzly is a large adult male that we've designated as Bear GB247, estimated to be about 8 years old and weighing approximately 450 pounds. He's been moving through his territory following the salmon runs and berry patches, which is completely normal behavior." Emily felt a small shiver of excitement mixed with nervousness at the mention of the grizzly bear. She had studied these magnificent animals extensively during her environmental science coursework, understanding both their critical ecological role and their potentially dangerous nature when encountered in the wild. "Have there been any incidents or aggressive encounters recently?" she asked. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Patty assured them, though her professional demeanor remained serious. GB247 has shown no signs of food conditioning or aggressive behavior toward humans. Our last confirmed sighting of him was 4 days ago, about 6 miles northwest of Mystic Lake, where our motion-activated trail cameras captured him fishing along Whitewater Creek. That said, it's important to understand that grizzly bears have enormous home ranges, sometimes covering hundreds of square miles, and they can move considerable distances very quickly when they want to. She opened a thick binder filled with laminated pages of safety protocols and emergency procedures. "I need to review our bear safety guidelines with you, which I'm required to do for all backcountry camping permits in bear habitat. These aren't just suggestions, they're proven strategies that can mean the difference between a safe, enjoyable trip and a potential tragedy." Moody. Over the next 30 minutes, Patty provided them with a comprehensive briefing on wilderness safety, covering everything from proper food storage techniques and the use of bear canisters to the importance of making noise while hiking and the proper response protocols for different types of wildlife encounters. She demonstrated the proper use of bear spray, a highly concentrated pepper spray that had proven effective in deterring aggressive bears when used correctly, and made sure both Jacob and Emily understood how to deploy it quickly and accurately in an emergency situation. Remember, she emphasized, bear spray is not a substitute for proper safety protocols and awareness. It's a last line of defense when all other prevention strategies have failed. The best bear encounter is no bear encounter at all, which means following proper food storage procedures, maintaining a clean campsite, and being aware of your surroundings at all times. Emily carefully read through all the informational materials, making notes in her guidebook and asking thoughtful questions about specific scenarios they might encounter. Her scientific background made her particularly interested in understanding the behavioral ecology of the bears they might see, and she found herself fascinated by the complex relationships between predator and prey species in the park's ecosystem. "One more thing," Patty added, pulling out a satellite communication device. "I'm going to recommend that you consider renting one of our emergency communicators for your trip. It's a small GPS device that allows you to send emergency signals to our dispatch center, even from remote areas where there's no cell phone coverage. Mystic Lake is pretty isolated, and while the chances of needing emergency assistance are very small, having the ability to call for help can provide peace of mind and potentially save valuable time in a serious situation." Jacob and Emily exchanged glances, and after a brief discussion, decided to rent the device. The additional cost was minimal compared to the potential value of being able to communicate with the outside world in case of an emergency, and both of them believed in thorough preparation for wilderness adventures. After completing all the necessary paperwork and safety briefings, they loaded their gear back into the Jeep and drove to the Cascade Trail trailhead, a well-maintained parking area with restroom facilities, bear-proof garbage containers, and an informational kiosk with current trail conditions and weather updates. The parking lot was already half full, despite the early hour, testimony to the popularity of the backcountry camping opportunities the park offered. They spent nearly an hour organizing their gear and double-checking their packing list, making sure they had everything necessary for 5 days of wilderness camping. Their backpacks contained high-quality, lightweight camping equipment, including a 4-season mountain tent rated for severe weather conditions, sleeping bags rated to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, a portable camp stove and fuel, water purification tablets and a pump filter, first aid supplies, emergency signaling equipment, and enough dehydrated and freeze-dried food for their planned stay, plus 2 extra days' worth of emergency rations. Jacob conducted a final safety check of their gear, examining the tent for any damage, testing their camp stove to make sure it was functioning properly, and verifying that their water purification system was working correctly. Emily reviewed their planned route one more time, checking the GPS coordinates of their campsite and making sure they both understood the navigation requirements for reaching their destination. At exactly 8:15 a.m., they shouldered their packs and began walking north on the Cascade Trail, leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization and entering a wilderness that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. The trail started as a wide, well-maintained path through dense forest of Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and Engelmann spruce, with an understory of huckleberry bushes, mountain ash, and various wildflower species that were just beginning their peak blooming season. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles, wildflowers, and the distant smell of snowmelt streams. Emily breathed deeply, feeling the stress and pressures of their wedding planning and everyday life beginning to melt away as they settled into the rhythm of wilderness travel. Jacob walked slightly ahead, setting a comfortable pace that would allow them to cover the necessary distance without exhausting themselves, his experienced eye constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of wildlife activity, weather changes, or any other factors that might affect their safety or comfort. They had been walking for about 45 minutes when they encountered their first other hikers of the day, a family of 4 from Calgary who were returning from a 3-day camping trip to a different area of the park. The father, David Chen, was a 42-year-old software engineer who had been bringing his family to Banff for wilderness camping trips for the past 8 years, building their skills and confidence gradually as his children grew older and more capable of handling longer and more challenging adventures. "Beautiful morning for a hike," David called out as they approached, his voice carrying the cheerful camaraderie that was common among wilderness enthusiasts. His wife, Linda, walked beside him with their 2 children, 14-year-old Sarah and 12-year-old Michael, all of them showing the satisfied tiredness that came from a successful camping adventure. "Absolutely perfect," Jacob replied, pausing to chat briefly about trail conditions and their respective destinations. "How was your trip? Any wildlife sightings?" Linda Chen, a 39-year-old pediatric nurse whose outdoor experience had grown considerably since marrying David, smiled as she adjusted her pack straps. "We saw a beautiful black bear with 2 cubs yesterday evening, probably about 2 miles back down the trail from where you're headed. They were feeding in a meadow about 50 yards off the trail, completely ignoring us. We watched them for probably 15 minutes before they moved deeper into the forest." Emily's eyes lit up with excitement at the possibility of seeing bears during their trip, though she understood the importance of maintaining a respectful and safe distance. Did they seem habituated to humans at all, or were they displaying natural avoidance behavior? "Very natural behavior," David replied, impressed by Emily's knowledgeable question. "They were aware of our presence but not concerned by it, which is exactly what you want to see. No signs of food conditioning or aggressive posturing. We made sure to give them plenty of space and kept moving once they started to show signs of moving in our direction." The families chatted for another few minutes, exchanging information about trail conditions, weather observations, and general safety considerations before continuing on their respective journeys. As the Chen family disappeared around a bend in the trail behind them, Emily felt a renewed sense of excitement about the adventure ahead and the possibility of experiencing the incredible wildlife that called this wilderness home. They reached the first creek crossing about an hour later, where Cascade Creek tumbled down from the high country through a series of small waterfalls and pools that reflected the towering peaks surrounding them. The wooden bridge was exactly as Patty had described, constructed from heavy timbers and equipped with sturdy handrails that provided both safety and stability for hikers carrying heavy packs. Emily stopped in the middle of the bridge to take photographs of the creek and the surrounding forest, marveling at the crystal-clear water that seemed to sparkle with an inner light as it flowed over smooth granite boulders worn into fantastic shapes by countless years of flowing water. The sound of the creek was hypnotic and peaceful, a constant background music that seemed to emphasize the profound silence of the deep wilderness surrounding them. "I can't believe how beautiful this is," she said, leaning against the bridge railing while Jacob checked their map and GPS coordinates. I expected it to be gorgeous, but this exceeds even my highest expectations. It feels like we're walking through a nature documentary or something." Jacob smiled at her enthusiasm, remembering his own first experiences in wilderness areas like this, and how they had fundamentally changed his understanding of the natural world and his place within it. "Just wait until we reach the meadows," he said. "If the wildflowers are as good as that ranger suggested, it's going to be absolutely incredible." They continued hiking, settling into the comfortable rhythm of wilderness travel, where time seemed to slow down and the pressures of modern life gradually faded away. The trail continued to follow Cascade Creek, sometimes running right alongside the water and other times climbing higher up the hillside to provide spectacular views of the creek valley and the mountain peaks beyond. About 2 hours into their hike, they encountered the second creek crossing, where the trail crossed a tributary stream that flowed down from a high cirque lake invisible among the peaks above them. This crossing required more care, as the creek was deeper and faster flowing than the first one, with water cold enough to numb their feet even through their waterproof hiking boots. Jacob crossed first, testing the stability of each stepping stone and using his hiking poles for additional balance, then turned to help Emily across the more challenging sections. Her pack was slightly lighter than his, but the uneven stones and fast-flowing water still required careful attention to avoid a slip that could result in injury or soaked gear. "Good job," he said as she completed the crossing successfully, her cheeks flushed with the exertion and excitement of the challenge. "You're getting the hang of this creek crossing business. By the end of the week, you'll be dancing across these streams like a mountain goat." The terrain began to change noticeably as they climbed higher, with the dense forest gradually giving way to more open areas where avalanches and natural disturbances had created meadows and clearings filled with wildflowers and young aspen trees. The trail became steeper and more challenging, requiring frequent rest stops to catch their breath and adjust their pack straps, as the thin mountain air made even experienced hikers work harder than usual. Emily found herself breathing heavily as they climbed through a particularly steep section of trail, her heart pounding from the combination of physical exertion and high altitude. She had trained extensively for this trip, spending months building her endurance with long hikes in the Colorado mountains near her home. But the combination of a heavy pack and the thin air at elevation was more challenging than she had anticipated. "Let's take a break," Jacob suggested, reading her breathing and recognizing the signs of altitude adjustment that affected most people when transitioning from sea level to mountain elevations. "There's no rush, and it's important to stay hydrated and let our bodies adjust to the altitude change." They found a comfortable spot beside the trail where a small clearing provided views back down the valley they had been climbing, offering their first real perspective on how far they had already traveled. Emily gratefully slipped off her pack and sat down on a fallen log, pulling out her water bottle and taking long, slow sips while she caught her breath and admired the spectacular scenery surrounding them. "Look how far we've come already," she said, pointing back down the valley where they could just make out the distant parking lot where they had started their hike. "It feels like we've been walking for hours, but we've covered so much ground. I'm starting to understand why you love this so much, Jake. There's something about being up here that makes everything else seem so small and insignificant." Jacob sat beside her on the log, pulling out his own water bottle and some trail mix that provided quick energy from nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate pieces. "That's exactly it," he agreed, his arms sliding around her shoulders as they sat together looking out over the incredible wilderness vista spread below them. "Out here, all the stuff that seems so important in our everyday lives just fades away. Work deadlines, bills, social obligations, even our phones don't work up here. It's just us and the mountains and whatever we can carry on our backs." They rested for about 20 minutes, eating energy bars and drinking water, while their bodies adjusted to the physical demands of high-altitude hiking with heavy packs. Emily used the time to study her field guide to Rocky Mountain wildflowers, trying to identify the various species they had been seeing along the trail, while Jacob checked their GPS coordinates and estimated their remaining travel time to reach their campsite. "According to the GPS, we've covered about 4.2 miles so far," he reported, consulting both the electronic device and their topographic map. "We're making good time, and we should reach Cascade Meadows in another hour or so. From there, it's about 3 more miles to the lake, but the terrain gets a bit more challenging as we climb up through the subalpine zone. Emily stood up and stretched, working out the stiffness that had developed in her legs and shoulders during their rest break. "I'm ready to keep going," she said, shouldering her pack with the kind of determination that Jacob had learned to admire in her approach to challenges. "I want to reach the meadows while the light is still good for photographs." According to my research, late morning is supposed to be the best time to see the wildflowers when they're fully open. They resumed hiking, and within 40 minutes found themselves entering the edge of Cascade Meadows, a spectacular alpine valley that stretched for nearly a mile between towering peaks on both sides, filled with what could only be described as a carpet of wildflowers in every color imaginable. Indian paintbrush in brilliant red and orange, lupines in deep purple and blue, mountain asters in white and pale pink, alpine forget-me-nots in sky blue, and dozens of other species created a natural display that exceeded even their highest expectations. Emily stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open in amazement as she took in the incredible vista spread before them. "Oh my God, Jake," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my entire life. It's like someone took every flower in the world and planted them all in one perfect mountain meadow." Jacob was equally impressed, despite having seen similar displays in other mountain ranges during his guiding career. There was something particularly spectacular about this meadow, perhaps because of the perfect timing of their visit or the ideal weather conditions that had allowed the flowers to reach peak bloom simultaneously. "This is definitely going in the top 5 most beautiful places I've ever seen," he agreed, pulling out his camera to capture images that they both knew could never fully convey the incredible beauty surrounding them. They spent nearly an hour in the meadows, taking photographs, identifying different wildflower species, and simply sitting quietly to absorb the peaceful beauty of this incredible natural display. Emily filled several pages of her journal with detailed observations about the plant communities they were seeing, the interactions between different species, and her emotional responses to experiencing such pristine wilderness beauty. "I keep thinking about how few people will ever see this," she said, as they prepared to continue their hike toward Mystic Lake. "We're probably among maybe a few hundred people each year who make the effort to hike back here and experience this incredible place. It makes me feel so grateful and also so responsible, like we're witnessing something precious that needs to be protected and preserved for future generations." The trail beyond the meadows climbed more steeply as they entered the subalpine forest zone, where the trees became shorter and more widely spaced, adapted to the harsh conditions of high altitude, intense solar radiation, and short growing seasons. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir dominated this ecosystem, their dark green needles and distinctive shapes creating a more austere but equally beautiful landscape than the lush forests they had hiked through earlier. Jacob maintained a steady but comfortable pace as they climbed, occasionally pausing to point out interesting geological features or to help Emily navigate particularly challenging sections of trail where loose rocks or steep grades required extra attention to safety. His years of guiding experience had taught him to constantly monitor his companions for signs of fatigue, altitude sickness, or other problems that could develop during strenuous mountain hiking. "How are you feeling?" he asked, as they paused at a switchback that provided another spectacular view of the valley below them and the meadows they had recently left behind. "Any signs of headache, nausea, or unusual tiredness that might indicate altitude adjustment issues?" Emily took a moment to assess her physical condition, recognizing the importance of honest self-evaluation during wilderness activities. "I'm definitely working hard, and I can feel the altitude in my breathing, but I feel strong overall," she replied. "No headache, no nausea, and my energy level seems good. I think all that training in Colorado is paying off." They continued climbing through increasingly spectacular terrain, with views opening up toward distant peaks and glaciers that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The trail traversed along steep hillsides, wound through groves of ancient trees, and occasionally crossed small streams that cascaded down from hidden lakes and snowfields high above them. About 6 hours after starting their hike, they crested a small ridge and got their first glimpse of Mystic Lake, a pristine alpine lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror, its deep blue-green waters surrounded by granite cliffs, subalpine meadows, and groves of white-bark pine that had somehow found purchase in the thin soil and harsh conditions of this high-altitude environment. "There it is," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying a note of reverence for the incredible natural beauty spread before them. "Mystic Lake, our home for the next 5 days." Emily stood beside him, completely speechless, as she took in the stunning vista that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The lake was perhaps half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, nestled in a cirque that had been carved by glacial action over thousands of years. Steep granite walls rose directly from the water on the far side, creating dramatic reflections and providing habitat for mountain goats and other wildlife adapted to cliff-dwelling life. The near shore was gentler, with small beaches of sand and gravel, meadows filled with alpine flowers, and several ideal spots for camping that were clearly designated by established fire rings and level tent platforms. Their designated campsite was located about 50 yards back from the lakeshore, positioned to provide both spectacular views and protection from the prevailing winds that could sweep down the valley with little warning. A small creek flowed past one side of the campsite, providing fresh water and the pleasant sound of flowing water that would serve as natural background music during their stay. "I can't believe this is real," Emily said, finally finding her voice as they began the short descent to their campsite. "It's like something out of a fairy tale or a fantasy novel. I keep expecting to see elves or unicorns or something equally magical appear from the forest." Jacob laughed at her enthusiasm, but he understood exactly what she meant. There was something otherworldly about places like this, locations so beautiful and pristine that they seemed to exist outside normal reality, offering a glimpse into what the world might have looked like before human civilization had left its mark on nearly every landscape on Earth. They reached their campsite at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, giving them plenty of time to set up their camp properly and explore the immediate area before evening. Jacob had learned long ago that establishing a comfortable and secure camp was the foundation of any successful wilderness experience, and he took pride in creating outdoor living spaces that were both functional and harmonious with the natural environment. "Let's take a few minutes to just look around and appreciate where we are before we start setting up," he suggested, dropping his pack on the designated tent platform and stretching muscles that had been working hard for over 6 hours of continuous hiking. "We've got plenty of time, and I want us to remember this moment when we first arrived at our honeymoon campsite." Emily agreed completely, sitting down on a convenient boulder and pulling out her water bottle and some energy food, while she simply absorbed the incredible beauty surrounding them. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle sound of the creek, the occasional call of a bird, and the whisper of wind through the trees. No mechanical sounds, no human voices, no evidence of civilization except for their own presence and the minimal camping infrastructure that had been designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment. "Listen to that silence," she said softly, her voice almost reverent. "When was the last time either of us experienced silence this complete? Even at home in Colorado, there's always traffic or airplanes or something. Up here, It's like the world has stopped spinning, and we're the only people left on Earth." Jacob nodded, understanding exactly what she meant, and feeling the same sense of profound peace that came from complete immersion in pristine wilderness. This was why he had chosen a career that allowed him to spend time in places like this, why he had been drawn to Emily, who shared his passion for the natural world, and why he had suggested this particular location for their honeymoon. He wanted to share with her the kind of transformative experience that could only be found in places like this, far from the distractions and pressures of modern life. After resting for about 15 minutes, they began the process of establishing their camp, working together with the kind of easy cooperation that had characterized their entire relationship. Jacob had taught Emily the fundamentals of wilderness camping during shorter trips over the past 2 years, and she had proven to be a quick learner with good instincts for outdoor living. They selected the optimal location for their tent within the designated camping area, looking for level ground that would drain well in case of rain, protection from prevailing winds, and proximity to water while maintaining the recommended distance from the lakeshore to minimize their environmental impact. Jacob used his hiking poles and a small folding shovel to clear away rocks and sticks that might cause discomfort during sleeping, while Emily unpacked their tent and organized their gear. Their tent was a high-quality 4-season mountain shelter designed for serious wilderness use, with a strong aluminum frame, waterproof nylon fly, and vestibule areas that provided protected space for cooking and gear storage. Setting it up required coordination between both of them, with Jacob managing the frame assembly, while Emily worked on staking out the corners and adjusting the tension of the guy lines that would keep the tent stable in wind. "Perfect," Jacob said as they completed the tent setup and stood back to admire their work. "This should keep us comfortable and dry no matter what the weather decides to do while we're here. Now let's get our sleeping system set up inside and then work on the kitchen area." Emily crawled into the tent to arrange their sleeping bags, inflatable sleeping pads, and personal gear, creating a comfortable interior living space that would serve as their bedroom for the next 5 nights. She had invested in high-quality sleeping equipment after learning from Jacob how important comfortable sleep was for enjoying multi-day wilderness adventures, and their sleeping bags were rated for much colder temperatures than they expected to encounter during their summer honeymoon trip. Meanwhile, Jacob established their cooking area in a location that was convenient to their tent, but followed all the recommended safety protocols for wilderness camping. He set up their portable camp stove on a stable, level surface away from any flammable vegetation, organized their food supplies in bear-proof containers that would be stored in the designated bear cache, located about 100 yards from their campsite, and filled their water bottles and hydration reservoir from the creek after treating the water with purification tablets and their portable pump filter. By 4:30 in the afternoon, they had established a comfortable and secure camp that would serve as their base for the next 5 days of wilderness exploration and relaxation. Emily stood at the edge of their site, looking out over Mystic Lake and the incredible mountain panorama surrounding them, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and accomplishment at having successfully reached this remote and beautiful destination. "I'm so proud of us," she said, turning to wrap her arms around Jacob's waist and lean against his chest. 6 months ago, I never would have believed I could hike 8 miles with a 40-pound pack and then set up a camp in a place like this. You've helped me discover capabilities I didn't even know I had." Jacob held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with the clean mountain air, and feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for having found someone who shared his deepest passions and was willing to push herself beyond her comfort zone to experience the incredible adventures the natural world offered. "You've been amazing, Em. Your preparation, your positive attitude, your willingness to tackle challenges that scare you. I couldn't ask for a better adventure partner or a better wife." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the immediate area around their campsite, following faint game trails through the meadows and along the lakeshore, identifying wildflowers and bird species, and taking photographs of the spectacular scenery that surrounded them. Emily filled several more pages of her journal with detailed observations about the ecosystem they were experiencing, while Jacob used his GPS unit to mark waypoints and potential exploration routes for the days ahead. As evening approached, they prepared their first wilderness dinner together as husband and wife, using their lightweight camp stove to heat water for freeze-dried meals that had been specially selected for their nutritional content, taste, and minimal environmental impact. Emily had spent considerable time researching backcountry food options, wanting to ensure they would eat well during their adventure while also following leave-no-trace principles that minimized their impact on the pristine environment they were visiting. Beef stew with vegetables and a side of wild rice pilaf, Jacob announced as he stirred their rehydrating meals. Not exactly five-star restaurant cuisine, but it smells pretty good, and we've definitely worked up an appetite after hiking all day. Emily laughed, arranging their lightweight camping dishes and utensils on the small portable table. After 6 hours of hiking, I think a peanut butter and jelly sandwich would taste like a gourmet meal. Besides, it's not about the food. It's about eating dinner together while watching the sunset over one of the most beautiful lakes in North America. I'd say that beats any fancy restaurant hands down. As they ate their simple but satisfying meal, the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, creating the kind of spectacular light display that photographers dream about, but rarely experience. The granite cliffs across the lake began to glow with warm orange and pink light, while the surface of the water reflected the changing colors of the sky in constantly shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. Emily found herself unable to eat for several minutes at a time, completely mesmerized by the incredible beauty of their surroundings and the profound sense of peace and contentment that came from sharing this experience with the man she loved. "I wish we could stay here forever," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I wish we never had to go back to jobs and bills and traffic and all the things that seem so important but really aren't important at all compared to this." Jacob reached across their small table to take her hand, understanding exactly what she was feeling and sharing her reluctance to return to the complexities of modern life. "We'll come back," he promised. "This doesn't have to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We can make wilderness adventures like this a regular part of our life together. In fact, I was thinking that maybe we should start planning our next trip before we even leave this one." As full darkness settled over the lake and the surrounding peaks, they cleaned their dishes and stored all their food in the bear-proof cache, following all the safety protocols they had learned during their pre-trip preparation. Jacob built a small campfire in the established fire ring, using only dead and downed wood that had been scattered by natural processes rather than damaging any living vegetation. The fire provided both warmth and a focal point for their evening together, crackling cheerfully as they sat side by side on their lightweight camping chairs, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their gratitude for having found each other. Emily pulled out her journal and wrote by firelight, trying to capture in words the incredible experiences and emotions of their first day in the wilderness together as husband and wife. "Listen," Jacob said suddenly, holding up his hand for silence as a sound echoed across the water from somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. It was a deep, resonant call that neither of them had ever heard before. Wild and haunting and somehow ancient, as if it belonged to a time before human civilization had changed the world. "What was that?" Emily whispered, feeling a shiver that was part excitement and part primitive fear at the wildness of the sound and the reminder that they were visitors in a landscape dominated by creatures far older and more powerful than themselves. "I think it was a bull elk," Jacob replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. "They make bugling calls during mating season, but it's a little early in the year for that. Could have been communicating with other elk in the area, or maybe responding to some stimulus we can't perceive." They sat quietly for several more minutes, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness around them, the gentle lapping of small waves against the lakeshore, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and occasionally other sounds that were harder to identify, but added to the sense of being surrounded by a complex ecosystem of creatures adapted to life in this harsh but beautiful environment. "I love this so much," Emily said as they prepared to retire to their tent for the night. "I love the physical challenge of getting here. I love the incredible beauty of this place. But most of all, I love sharing it with you. This feels like the perfect beginning to our marriage, facing challenges together, supporting each other, and experiencing something that most people never get to experience." Jacob banked their fire carefully, making sure it was completely extinguished and would not pose any risk of escaping and damaging the pristine environment they were visiting. "Sweet dreams, Mrs. Harris," he said, as they zipped themselves into their tent and settled into their sleeping bags for their first night of married life in the wilderness. "Tomorrow we'll explore the area around the lake and maybe try some fishing if you're interested." Emily snuggled into her sleeping bag, feeling warm and comfortable and completely content as she listened to the gentle sounds of the night forest around them. "Good night, Mr. Harris," she replied. "Thank you for bringing me to the most beautiful place on earth for our honeymoon. I can't wait to see what adventures tomorrow brings." Neither of them could have imagined that their tomorrow would bring them face to face with forces far more dangerous and unpredictable than anything they had prepared for, or that their perfect wilderness honeymoon was about to become a struggle for survival against one of North America's most powerful predators. As they drifted off to sleep in their cozy tent beside the pristine alpine lake, they were completely unaware that less than 2 miles away, a massive grizzly bear designated as GB-247 was following a scent trail that would eventually lead him directly to their campsite and change their lives forever. The night passed peacefully, with Emily waking only once around 3 a.m. to the sound of what seemed to be a large animal moving through the forest, somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. She listened for several minutes, her heart beating faster as she tried to identify the source of the sounds, but eventually the forest fell silent again and she drifted back into deep, contented sleep, unaware that those sounds had been made by the very predator that park officials had been monitoring, and that would soon become the central figure in a tragedy that would make headlines across North America and forever change how wilderness visitors approached safety in bear country. Jacob woke first on their second morning, as was his habit, developed through years of wilderness guiding, emerging from his sleeping bag at 6:15 a.m. to check weather conditions and assess their campsite for any overnight developments that might affect their planned activities for the day. The morning was crisp and clear, with a light frost coating their tent fly and the surrounding vegetation, evidence of the dramatic temperature drops that were common at high altitude, even during summer months. He unzipped the tent vestibule quietly, trying not to wake Emily, and stepped outside into air so clean and pure it almost hurt to breathe after a lifetime of living at lower altitudes, where atmospheric pollution was an unavoidable part of daily life. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding peaks like a mirror, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat in the thin mountain air. Emily stirred as he moved around the campsite, checking their bear cache and beginning to prepare water for coffee and breakfast. "Good morning, beautiful," he said softly as she emerged from the tent, her hair tousled from sleep and her face glowing with the healthy color that came from sleeping well in fresh mountain air. "How did you sleep?" Like a rock, she replied, stretching and breathing deeply as she took in the spectacular morning vista surrounding their campsite. I think that was the best night's sleep I've had in months. There's something about sleeping outdoors that's so much more restful than being indoors, even in the most comfortable bed. Maybe it's the fresh air, or the complete silence, or just the absence of all the artificial lights and electromagnetic fields that surround us in the city. They prepared a simple but nourishing breakfast of instant oatmeal supplemented with dried fruit, nuts, and energy-dense supplements, along with strong coffee that provided both warmth and caffeine to fuel their planned day of exploration around the lake. Emily updated her journal with observations about their first night in the wilderness, while Jacob consulted his topographic maps and GPS unit to plan potential routes for their morning activities. "I was thinking we could spend the morning exploring the north shore of the lake," he suggested, pointing out features on his map. "There are some interesting geological formations over there, and according to this topo map, there might be some small caves or overhangs where we could find wildlife sign, or maybe even some rock art left by indigenous peoples who used this area before it became a national park." Emily was immediately interested, her scientific training making her curious about both the geological processes that had shaped this landscape and the human history of the region. "That sounds perfect. I'd love to learn more about the natural and cultural history of this area. Do you think there's any chance we might see some of the wildlife that Patty mentioned during our safety briefing yesterday?" "Always a possibility," Jacob replied, though his tone carried the cautious optimism of someone who understood that wildlife sightings in their natural habitat were special events that couldn't be predicted or guaranteed. Early morning and late evening are typically the best times for wildlife activity, when most animals are moving to and from their feeding areas or water sources. We'll want to make plenty of noise as we hike to avoid surprising anything and keep our bear spray easily accessible just in case. They finished breakfast and cleaned their dishes thoroughly, following leave-no-trace principles that required them to pack out all food waste and leave no evidence of their presence that might attract wildlife or detract from the wilderness experience of future visitors. Emily helped Jacob secure their food and scented items in the bear cache, learning the proper techniques for wilderness food storage that were essential for safety in bear country. At 8:45 a.m., they set out on their first exploration of the area around Mystic Lake, following a faint game trail that led around the northern shore through meadows filled with alpine wildflowers and groves of whitebark pine that had been shaped by decades of harsh mountain weather into fantastic sculptural forms. Jacob carried a day pack with water, snacks, first aid supplies, and emergency equipment, while Emily carried her camera, field guides, and journal for documenting their discoveries. The morning was perfect for hiking, with crisp, clear air that made every detail of the surrounding landscape stand out in sharp relief. They moved slowly, taking time to identify wildflower species, examine interesting rock formations, and simply absorb the incredible beauty of their surroundings. Emily found herself stopping frequently to take photographs, trying to capture images that would help them remember every detail of this incredible experience when they returned to their normal lives. "Look at this," she called out as they approached a small inlet where the lake's shoreline curved inward to create a protected cove surrounded by large granite boulders. "The water is so clear here, you can see all the way to the bottom, and look at the size of those trout swimming around. They look like they've never seen a human being before." Jacob joined her at the water's edge, marveling at the pristine clarity of the lake water and the obvious health of the fish population that thrived in this protected environment. "Those are probably cutthroat trout," he said, identifying the species based on their size, coloration, and behavior patterns. "They're native to these high-altitude lakes and streams, and they can live for decades in environments like this, where there's minimal human disturbance and plenty of natural food sources." Emily pulled out her field guide to Rocky Mountain fish species and spent several minutes documenting the different types of aquatic life they could observe in the clear water. "This is like having our own private aquarium," she said with delight. "I could sit here for hours just watching them swim around and interact with each other. It's like getting a glimpse into a completely different world that exists right alongside ours, but operates by completely different rules." They continued around the northern shore of the lake, occasionally following established game trails, but more often creating their own route through the meadows and along the rocky shoreline. Jacob's wilderness experience had taught him to read the landscape for the safest and most efficient routes, while also minimizing their environmental impact by avoiding sensitive areas where their passage might damage vegetation or disturb wildlife habitat. About 2 hours into their morning exploration, they discovered exactly what Jacob had hoped to find: a series of shallow caves and overhangs in the granite cliffs that rose directly from the lake's edge on the northwestern shore. These geological features had been carved by thousands of years of freeze-thaw cycles, glacial action, and water erosion, creating sheltered spaces that had obviously been used by various wildlife species over many generations. "This is incredible," Emily said, as they carefully approached the largest of the overhangs, a shelter that extended about 15 feet back into the cliff face and was tall enough for them to stand upright in most areas. "Look at all the signs of animal activity in here. There are scratches on the rock walls and what looks like the remains of old nests or dens." Jacob examined the evidence with the trained eye of someone who had spent years reading wildlife sign and understanding animal behavior patterns. "Definitely bear sign," he said, pointing out claw marks scratched deep into the granite walls. "These look old, probably from previous seasons, when bears used this shelter during bad weather, or maybe as a daybed during hot summer afternoons. And look here, these smaller tracks and droppings are probably from pika or marmots that use these rocky areas as their primary habitat." Emily pulled out her camera to document the wildlife evidence they had discovered, fascinated by this glimpse into the complex web of animal relationships that characterized high-altitude ecosystems. "It's amazing to think about all the different species that have used this exact same shelter over the years, maybe over centuries. Bears, small mammals, birds, maybe even mountain goats or sheep during severe weather. It's like a wildlife hotel that's been operating since long before humans ever set foot in this area." They spent nearly an hour exploring the various caves and overhangs, documenting their findings and speculating about the geological processes that had created these formations. Emily's scientific training made her particularly interested in understanding how different types of rock weathered and eroded under the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain environments, while Jacob's practical experience helped him interpret the wildlife sign they encountered and understand how different species used these natural shelters. As they prepared to leave the cave area and continue their exploration of the lake's shoreline, Jacob paused at the entrance to the largest overhang and looked carefully in all directions, his expression becoming more serious as he studied the surrounding terrain with the kind of focused attention that Emily had learned to recognize as his guide mode when he was assessing potential safety concerns. "What is it?" she asked, noting the change in his demeanor and feeling a small flutter of concern in her stomach. "Did you see something?" "Maybe nothing," Jacob replied, though he continued to scan the area carefully. "I thought I heard something moving in the forest behind us, but it might just have been the wind or a small animal. In bear country, it's always better to be overly cautious than to ignore potential warning signs." Emily felt her heart rate increase slightly as she became more aware of their surroundings and the fact that they were indeed in prime habitat for some of North America's most powerful predators. "Should we head back toward camp?" she asked, recognizing that Jacob's years of wilderness experience had taught him to trust his instincts about potential dangers. "Let's continue with our planned route," Jacob decided after another careful survey of the area. "But we'll make more noise as we hike, and I want us to stay closer together." Remember what that ranger told us about most bear encounters being the result of surprise meetings where the bear feels cornered or threatened? If there are bears in the area, we want them to know we're here and have plenty of opportunity to avoid us. They resumed their hike around the lake, but now their conversation was louder and more frequent, following the standard recommendations for hiking in bear country. Jacob also began periodically calling out, "Hey, bear!" or clapping his hands, creating enough noise to announce their presence to any wildlife in the area, while still allowing them to enjoy their exploration of this incredible wilderness environment. The remainder of their morning passed without incident, as they completed their circuit of the northern shore and began working their way back toward their campsite along the southern edge of the lake. They discovered several more interesting geological features, including a small waterfall where a creek tumbled down from the high country to feed into the lake, and a series of beaver ponds in a marshy area that supported a completely different ecosystem than the rocky shores and alpine meadows that characterized most of the lake's perimeter. "Look at all the different habitats that exist just around this one lake," Emily observed as they paused to rest and eat lunch beside the beaver ponds. "Rocky shores, alpine meadows, marshy wetlands, dense forest, open meadows. It's like a complete cross-section of Rocky Mountain ecosystems all in one location. No wonder this area supports such diverse wildlife populations." Jacob nodded in agreement, admiring both the ecological complexity of their surroundings and Emily's growing understanding of wilderness ecosystems. "That's exactly why places like this are so important to protect," he said. "These high-altitude lakes and the surrounding habitats are like islands of wilderness in an increasingly developed world. They provide critical habitat for species that can't survive anywhere else, and they give us a chance to experience ecosystems that have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years." As they sat beside the beaver ponds, eating their trail lunch of energy bars, dried fruit and nuts, Emily noticed movement in the forest on the far side of the marsh, about 200 yards away from their position. "Jake," she said quietly, pointing toward the area where she had seen the motion. "There's something moving over there in the trees." Jacob followed her gaze and immediately spotted what had caught her attention, a large, dark-colored animal moving slowly through the forest, with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested it was following a specific scent trail or traveling toward a known destination. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking the distinctive shoulder hump, massive size, and characteristic movement pattern that identified the creature as a grizzly bear. "Grizzly," Jacob said quietly, reaching slowly into his pack to retrieve their binoculars while being careful not to make any sudden movements that might attract the bear's attention. "Looks like a large adult, probably male based on the size. He's moving parallel to the shoreline, maybe following game trails or scent marks from other animals." Emily felt a surge of excitement mixed with healthy fear as she watched the magnificent predator through the binoculars Jacob handed her. This was exactly the kind of wildlife encounter she had hoped to experience during their trip, but seeing a grizzly bear in its natural habitat was both thrilling and sobering, a reminder of the very real power and potential danger represented by these incredible animals. "He's huge," she whispered, trying to keep her voice low while still expressing her amazement at the bear's impressive size and obvious physical power. "I had no idea they were that big. He looks like he could weigh as much as 3 or 4 people put together. Jacob estimated the bear's weight at somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds, making it one of the larger grizzlies he had ever seen in the wild. The animal's fur was a rich brown color with lighter-colored tips that gave it the grizzled appearance that had given grizzly bears their common name, and its movements displayed the confident power of an apex predator completely at home in its environment. "What should we do?" Emily asked, suddenly aware that their lunch spot beside the beaver ponds offered limited escape routes if the bear decided to investigate their presence. "Should we try to back away slowly or stay put until he moves on?" Jacob considered their options carefully, drawing on his training and experience with large predator encounters. The bear was currently moving away from their position and showed no signs of having detected their presence, which was the ideal situation for a safe wildlife viewing experience. However, their location beside the marsh left them somewhat exposed, with water on one side and only a few possible retreat routes through the surrounding forest. "For now, let's just stay very still and quiet," he decided. "He doesn't seem to know we're here, and he's moving away from us. As long as he continues on his current path, we should be fine. But I want us to be ready to back away slowly if he changes direction or starts moving toward us." They remained motionless for nearly 15 minutes, watching in fascination as the grizzly bear continued its journey through the forest, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents or to feed on some plant material they couldn't identify from their distance. Emily found herself completely mesmerized by the animal's grace and power, the way it moved through the wilderness with complete confidence and awareness of its surroundings. "This is incredible," she whispered, as the bear gradually disappeared deeper into the forest and was lost from sight among the trees. "I feel like we just witnessed something most people will never get to see. A wild grizzly bear in its natural habitat, completely undisturbed by human presence. That might be the most amazing wildlife encounter of my entire life." Jacob shared her excitement and sense of privilege at having witnessed such a spectacular example of North American wildlife. But his guide training also made him acutely aware of the implications of having confirmed the presence of a large grizzly bear in their immediate area. "That was definitely special," he agreed, "but it also means we need to be extra careful about our safety protocols for the rest of our trip. That bear is obviously comfortable in this area, and there's a good chance we might encounter him again during the next few days." They packed up their lunch supplies carefully, making sure not to leave any food scraps or scented items that might attract wildlife to their resting spot, and began the hike back to their campsite with heightened awareness of their surroundings and renewed commitment to following all the bear safety protocols they had learned during their pre-trip preparation. "I'm definitely going to write about this encounter in detail in my journal tonight," Emily said, as they walked along the lakeshore toward their camp. "I want to record everything I can remember about his appearance, his behavior, the way he moved through the forest. It was like getting a glimpse into a world that existed long before humans arrived in North America, when bears like that were the undisputed masters of the wilderness." The afternoon passed quietly as they returned to their campsite and spent time organizing their gear, planning their activities for the following day, and simply relaxing in the incredible natural setting that had become their temporary home. Jacob checked their food storage system and reviewed their safety equipment, while Emily updated her journal with detailed observations about their morning's discoveries and their grizzly bear encounter. As evening approached, they prepared another simple but satisfying dinner and built their nightly campfire, settling into the comfortable routine of wilderness living that had quickly become second nature. The sunset over Mystic Lake was even more spectacular than the previous evening, with dramatic cloud formations creating constantly changing patterns of light and shadow across the water and surrounding peaks. "I could get used to this lifestyle," Emily said as they sat beside their fire, warm and comfortable, and completely content with their simple surroundings. No television, no internet, no phone calls or text messages or email. Just us and the mountains and whatever we need to survive and be comfortable. There's something so pure and honest about living this way, even if it's just for a few days. Jacob stirred the coals of their fire, creating small showers of sparks that rose into the clear mountain air before winking out against the backdrop of stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "That's part of why I love guiding wilderness trips," he said. "Most people spend their whole lives surrounded by artificial environments and technological distractions, never really experiencing the natural world that shaped human evolution for millions of years. When you strip away all the modern complications and just focus on the basics of food, shelter, warmth, and safety, you discover parts of yourself you never knew existed." They talked quietly beside their fire until nearly 10 p.m., sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their growing appreciation for the wilderness lifestyle they were experiencing together. Emily filled several more pages of her journal with reflections about their second day in the mountains, trying to capture not just the events they had experienced, but the emotional and spiritual impact of being immersed in such pristine, natural beauty. As they prepared to retire to their tent for their second night beside Mystic Lake, neither of them could have imagined that their peaceful wilderness honeymoon was about to take a horrific turn that would test their survival skills, their love for each other, and their will to live in ways they had never imagined possible. The same grizzly bear they had observed that afternoon was at that very moment following scent trails that would lead him directly to their campsite, drawn by curiosities and instincts that would soon transform their romantic adventure into a desperate struggle for survival against one of nature's most formidable predators. Emily woke abruptly at 2:17 a.m. to a sound that seemed to penetrate directly into her subconscious mind, bypassing her rational thoughts and triggering the kind of primitive fear response that had kept her ancestors alive through millions of years of evolution. Her heart was already pounding as she emerged from the depths of sleep, her body flooded with adrenaline before her conscious mind had even processed what had awakened her. Beside her, Jacob was also stirring, his own survival instincts responding to whatever stimulus had disturbed their peaceful sleep. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the mountain night. "Something's outside," Jacob replied quietly, reaching for the flashlight that he kept beside his sleeping bag for exactly this type of situation. "Stay calm and don't move. Let me listen for a minute and try to figure out what we're dealing with." They lay perfectly still in their sleeping bags, straining to hear any sounds that might indicate the presence of wildlife near their campsite. The silence seemed almost oppressive after being awakened so suddenly, but gradually they began to distinguish the normal night sounds of the forest from something else. A different kind of movement that suggested the presence of a large animal somewhere in the darkness beyond their tent. Then they heard it again, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from somewhere near their bear cache, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the forest around their campsite. Jacob's blood ran cold as he recognized the sounds as being consistent with a large bear investigating their camp, possibly attracted by food odors or simply following territorial patrol routes that happened to intersect with their chosen camping location. "Bear," he whispered to Emily, keeping his voice as quiet as possible while reaching for the bear spray that he kept in the tent vestibule for emergency situations. "Sounds like it's near our food cache. Remember what we learned about proper response to bear encounters at camp. No sudden movements, no bright lights unless absolutely necessary, and be prepared to use the bear spray if it approaches our tent." Emily felt her mouth go dry with fear as the reality of their situation sank in. They were alone in the wilderness, miles from any help, with what sounded like a very large and potentially dangerous predator investigating their campsite in the middle of the night. All their preparation and safety training suddenly felt inadequate in the face of this very real and immediate threat. The sounds outside continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Heavy footsteps circling their camp, occasional grunting or huffing sounds that Jacob recognized as typical bear vocalizations, and periodic pauses that might have indicated the animal was investigating specific objects or scent sources around their site. "What's it doing?" Emily whispered, fighting to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. "Why isn't it leaving?" "Probably just investigating," Jacob replied, though his own voice carried more tension than he intended. "Bears are naturally curious, and our campsite represents something new and different in its territory. As long as it doesn't try to get into our tent or show aggressive behavior, it will probably move on once it satisfies its curiosity about our presence." But even as he spoke those reassuring words, Jacob was beginning to feel a growing sense of unease about this particular encounter. The bear's behavior seemed more persistent and focused than the typical brief investigation he would expect from a wild animal encountering human campers. Most bears, when they discovered human presence, would either avoid the area entirely or conduct a quick investigation before moving on to more familiar territory. The sounds moved closer to their tent, and both Emily and Jacob could hear the distinctive huffing and sniffing sounds that indicated the bear was actively scent investigating their immediate sleeping area. Jacob gripped the bear spray canister tightly, ready to deploy it if the animal made any attempt to damage their tent or force entry to their shelter. "Jake," Emily whispered urgently, "what if it tries to get into the tent? What if it thinks we're food or a threat to its territory?" Before Jacob could respond, they heard a new sound that made both of their hearts stop. The distinctive noise of something large and heavy pushing against the side of their tent, followed by what sounded like claws scraping against the waterproof fabric of their shelter. The wall of the tent actually bulged inward slightly as whatever was outside pressed against it, and Emily had to bite back a scream of terror as she realized that only a thin layer of nylon fabric separated them from a predator that could easily kill them both. "Don't move," Jacob breathed, his hand steady on the bear spray despite the fear coursing through his body. "Don't make any sounds." Maybe it will lose interest and move away. But instead of moving away, the bear seemed to become more interested in their tent, pushing against different sections of the walls and making huffing sounds that suggested it was actively trying to understand what it had found. Jacob could smell the distinctive musky odor of the animal through the tent fabric, a wild scent that emphasized just how close they were to a creature that belonged to an entirely different world than their own. Emily pressed herself against Jacob, drawing what comfort she could from his presence while fighting to maintain the silence that might be their only protection against the massive predator just inches away from them. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears and wondered if the bear could somehow sense their fear through the tent walls. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, the bear stepped back from their tent and the sounds began to move away, growing fainter as the animal apparently lost interest in their shelter and continued its investigation of other areas of their campsite. Jacob and Emily remained frozen in their sleeping bags for another 20 minutes, listening to the gradually fading sounds as the bear moved through the forest around them. "Is it gone?" Emily finally whispered when the forest had been silent for several minutes. "I think so," Jacob replied, though he continued to listen intently for any signs that the animal might return. "But we need to stay alert for the rest of the night." Bears sometimes circle back to investigate areas they found interesting, and we have no way of knowing if this one has moved on permanently or is just taking a break from checking out our camp. Neither of them slept for the remainder of the night, taking turns listening for sounds that might indicate the bear's return while the other tried to rest. Jacob maintained his grip on the bear spray throughout the night, and Emily found herself jumping at every small sound: the settling of their tent fabric in the night breeze, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle lapping of tiny waves against the lakeshore. When dawn finally began to brighten the eastern sky, Jacob carefully unzipped the tent vestibule and looked outside, scanning their campsite for any signs of the bear's nighttime visit. What he saw made his stomach clench with concern. Clear evidence that a very large bear had spent considerable time investigating every aspect of their camp. You need to see this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of serious concern that immediately got Emily's attention. She joined him at the tent opening and gasped at the obvious signs of their nocturnal visitor. Large paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth around their tent, some of them showing the distinctive claw marks that identified them as grizzly tracks. The bear had obviously circled their entire campsite multiple times, investigating their cooking area, their gear storage location, and every other aspect of their temporary home. "Those tracks are huge," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly as the reality of how close they had come to a potentially deadly encounter began to sink in. "That bear must have been right beside our tent for who knows how long, and there was nothing between us and it except a piece of fabric." Jacob studied the tracks carefully, using his wilderness experience to read the story they told about their visitor's size, behavior, and intentions. "Based on these prints, I'd estimate this bear at somewhere between 450 and 500 pounds, he said grimly. "That's a very large grizzly, probably the same one we saw yesterday afternoon. And look at this. He didn't just pass through our camp, he systematically investigated every part of it." Emily followed Jacob as he pointed out the various areas where the bear had left evidence of its presence. Scratches on trees where it had marked its territory, areas where it had dug or pawed at the ground, and most disturbing of all, clear evidence that it had spent considerable time examining their bear cache and food storage area. "Did it get into our food?" Emily asked, suddenly realizing that a bear that had successfully obtained human food could become much more dangerous and persistent in its future encounters with campers. Jacob inspected their bear cache carefully and was relieved to find that the storage system had performed exactly as designed, keeping their food and scented items secure, despite what had obviously been a determined investigation by a very large and intelligent predator. "No breach," he reported, though his expression remained serious. But the fact that it spent so much time trying to figure out how to get into the cache suggests it was highly motivated by food odors. That's not a good sign for our safety if it decides to come back. They spent the next hour carefully documenting the bear's visit with photographs and detailed written observations, both for their own records and in case they needed to report the incident to park authorities. Emily found herself fascinated by the wealth of information contained in the tracks and other sign, despite her ongoing concern about their safety. "Look at the depth of these prints," she said, kneeling beside one of the clearest tracks to photograph it with a coin for scale. "You can see individual claw marks and pad details. This bear was moving slowly and deliberately, not just passing through but really investigating our camp thoroughly." Jacob nodded grimly as he considered the implications of what they had discovered. "This level of interest in human campers is concerning," he admitted. "Most bears will avoid human camps or conduct only a brief investigation before moving on. The fact that this one spent what appears to have been at least an hour systematically examining every aspect of our site suggests either unusual curiosity or possible food conditioning from previous human encounters." As they prepared breakfast and discussed their options for the day, Both Emily and Jacob were acutely aware that their wilderness honeymoon had taken on a much more serious tone. The romantic adventure they had planned was now overshadowed by the very real presence of a large and potentially dangerous predator that had demonstrated considerable interest in their campsite. "What do you think we should do?" Emily asked as they ate their morning meal, both of them constantly scanning their surroundings for any signs of the bear's return. "Should we pack up and hike out today, or try to continue with our planned stay?" Jacob considered their options carefully, weighing his desire to provide Emily with the wilderness experience she had been looking forward to against his responsibility for her safety and his growing concern about the unusual behavior they had witnessed from their nocturnal visitor. "Let's give it one more day," he finally decided. "Bears that get food from human campers become much more dangerous and persistent. But this one didn't breach our food storage system. It might have satisfied its curiosity and moved on to other parts of its territory. But we'll need to be extra vigilant about our safety protocols, and if we see any more signs of unusual bear activity, we'll pack up and head out immediately." Emily agreed with his assessment, though she found herself feeling much more nervous about their surroundings than she had during their first 2 days in the wilderness. Every sound in the forest now seemed potentially threatening, and she caught herself constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of movement that might indicate the return of their massive visitor. They spent the morning close to their campsite, organizing gear and discussing safety procedures rather than venturing out on another exploration of the lake area. Jacob used the time to review their emergency equipment and communication devices, while Emily updated her journal with detailed accounts of their bear encounter and her thoughts about wilderness safety in predator habitat. "I keep thinking about how different this feels from our first couple of days here," Emily said as they sat beside their rebuilt campfire, both of them keeping their bear spray within easy reach. "Yesterday morning I felt like we were visiting paradise. Everything was so peaceful and beautiful and perfect. Now I feel like we're being watched, like we're visitors in someone else's territory, and they're not entirely happy about our presence." Jacob understood exactly what she meant, having experienced similar shifts in awareness during previous wilderness adventures, when the reality of sharing the landscape with large predators became impossible to ignore. "That's actually a healthy response," he told her. "It means you're developing real wilderness awareness, instead of just treating this like an outdoor theme park. The bears were always here, we just didn't know about them during our first couple of days." Around noon, they decided to take a short walk along the immediate shoreline near their camp, staying within sight of their tent and maintaining constant awareness of potential escape routes in case they encountered their visitor or any other wildlife. Emily carried her camera and field guides, trying to recapture some of the scientific enthusiasm that had characterized their earlier explorations, while Jacob kept his attention focused on reading the landscape for signs of bear activity. They had walked perhaps 200 yards from their campsite when Jacob suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence, his expression becoming intensely focused as he studied something in the forest ahead of them. Emily followed his gaze and felt her heart skip a beat as she spotted what had caught his attention: fresh bear tracks in the soft earth beside a small stream that fed into the lake. "Those are new," Jacob said quietly, kneeling to examine the tracks more carefully. "Probably made within the last few hours, maybe while we were having breakfast. Look at the direction they're heading, directly toward our campsite." Emily felt a chill of fear as she realized that their nocturnal visitor had not moved on to other parts of its territory as they had hoped, but was instead continuing to show interest in their specific location. "What does that mean for our safety?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jacob stood up slowly, his expression grim, as he considered the implications of finding fresh sign so close to their camp. "It means this bear has established some kind of routine that includes investigating our campsite," he said. "That's exactly the kind of behavior pattern that wildlife managers worry about most, when bears start associating specific locations with human presence and potentially with food rewards." They turned around immediately and headed back toward their camp, both of them scanning the forest around them with heightened awareness and growing concern about their safety situation. Emily found herself imagining the massive predator they had encountered the previous afternoon watching them from the concealment of the dense forest, and she had to fight the urge to break into a run, despite knowing that running could trigger a chase response in any nearby bears. "Jake," she said as they approached their campsite, "I'm starting to think we should seriously consider packing up and hiking out today. I know we planned to stay for 5 days, but this doesn't feel safe anymore. That bear obviously considers this area part of its regular territory, and we're basically camping in the middle of its living room." Jacob was beginning to reach the same conclusion, despite his reluctance to cut short their honeymoon adventure. His years of guiding experience had taught him to trust his instincts about safety situations, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that their current situation was developing into something potentially dangerous. "Let's give it until this evening," he suggested as they reached their tent. "If we see any more fresh sign, or if the bear returns to investigate our camp again tonight, we'll pack up first thing in the morning and head out. I don't want to panic and abandon our trip based on normal bear behavior, but I also don't want to ignore legitimate safety concerns." Emily agreed to the compromise, though she spent the rest of the afternoon feeling increasingly anxious about their situation. She found herself unable to concentrate on reading or writing in her journal, instead constantly scanning their surroundings for any signs of movement that might indicate they were being watched or approached by wildlife. As evening approached and they began preparing their dinner, both of them were acutely aware that the previous night's encounter had occurred during the early morning hours, and they had no way of knowing whether their visitor might return at the same time or establish a different pattern of investigation. "I think we should take turns staying awake tonight," Jacob suggested as they finished eating and began securing their food in the bear cache. "Someone should always be alert and ready to respond if we have another visitor. We can do 2-hour shifts so neither of us gets too exhausted." Emily readily agreed to the plan, recognizing that another night like the previous one could leave them both too sleep-deprived to make good decisions about their safety. She volunteered to take the first watch, from 10 p.m. to midnight, while Jacob would cover midnight to 2 a.m., and then they would alternate throughout the night. As darkness settled over Mystic Lake and the surrounding peaks, they built their nightly campfire, but found themselves unable to enjoy the peaceful evening routine that had characterized their first 2 nights in the wilderness. Every sound from the forest around them seemed potentially threatening, and both of them found their attention constantly drawn to the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. "I keep thinking about what that ranger said during our safety briefing," Emily said, as they sat beside their fire, both of them holding cups of hot tea that provided comfort and warmth against the chill mountain air. She mentioned that this particular bear, GB247, had been moving through his territory following salmon runs and berry patches. What if our campsite is located along one of his regular travel routes? Jacob had been wondering about the same possibility, understanding that bears were creatures of habit that often followed established trails and routes through their territory, especially when moving between seasonal food sources. That would explain why he's shown such persistent interest in this specific location, he agreed. We might have unknowingly set up our camp right in the middle of a highway that he uses regularly to move between different parts of his home range. The thought that they might be camping in the equivalent of a bear's driveway was deeply unsettling, and both of them began to seriously question the wisdom of remaining in their current location for the remaining 3 days of their planned trip. What had started as a romantic wilderness adventure was increasingly feeling like a potentially dangerous miscalculation that could put them both at serious risk. Emily took the first watch as planned, sitting beside their banked fire with the bear spray in her lap and Jacob's powerful flashlight within easy reach. The night sounds of the wilderness seemed much more ominous than they had during their first 2 evenings, and she found herself jumping at every small noise. The hoot of an owl, the splash of a beaver in the distant marsh, the rustle of wind through the trees. Around 11:30 p.m., she heard something that made her blood run cold, the distinctive sound of heavy footsteps moving through the forest somewhere in the darkness beyond their campsite. The footsteps were too heavy and too regular to be made by any small animal, and they seemed to be moving with the kind of purposeful direction that suggested a large predator following a specific route or investigating a known location. "Jake," she whispered urgently, reaching over to shake his shoulder. "Wake up, there's something out there." Jacob came awake instantly, his years of wilderness experience having trained him to emerge from sleep fully alert when awakened by potential danger signals. "What kind of sounds?" he asked quietly, reaching for his own bear spray while listening intently to the night forest around them. "Heavy footsteps," Emily replied, her voice barely audible. "Coming from the same direction as last night, moving toward our camp." They sat in complete silence for several minutes, straining to hear any sounds that might indicate the approach of their nocturnal visitor. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them, and even the normal night sounds of insects and small animals seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was aware of the presence of a major predator. Then they heard it, a deep, huffing sound that both of them immediately recognized from the previous night, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush with the confident power of an animal that had no natural enemies in this environment. "It's back," Jacob said grimly, gripping his bear spray and preparing for what might be another long night of tense vigilance. "Same behavior pattern as last night. This is definitely not random. This bear has established some kind of routine that includes investigating our campsite." Emily felt her hands shaking as the reality of their situation became undeniable. They were dealing with a massive predator that had decided their campsite was worthy of regular investigation, and they had no way of knowing what might happen if the bear's curiosity escalated into more aggressive behavior. The sounds grew closer, and soon they could hear the familiar huffing and sniffing that indicated the bear was conducting another systematic investigation of their camp. But this time, something was different. The animal seemed more confident, more familiar with their presence, as if the previous night's encounter had reduced its natural wariness of human campers. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice tight with fear, "what if it's getting used to us? What if each night it gets a little braver and a little more willing to approach our tent?" Before Jacob could respond, they heard a sound that made both of them freeze with terror. The distinctive noise of something large and heavy, not just pushing against their tent, but actually trying to manipulate the fabric with what sounded like claws. The wall of their shelter bulged inward much more dramatically than it had the previous night, and they could hear scratching sounds that suggested the bear was actively testing the strength and integrity of their protective barrier. "Don't move," Jacob breathed, though his own body was trembling with the effort of remaining still while a 450-pound predator literally tried to find a way into their shelter. "Don't make any sounds. Maybe it will lose interest like last night." But instead of losing interest, the bear seemed to become more determined in its investigation of their tent. They could hear it moving around the perimeter of their shelter, pushing against different sections of the walls and making sounds that suggested it was trying to understand how to gain access to whatever was inside. Emily pressed herself against Jacob, drawing what comfort she could from his presence, while fighting a growing sense of panic as she realized that their thin nylon shelter was the only thing separating them from a predator that could easily kill them both. The musky scent of the bear was overpowering now, and she could actually hear its breathing just inches away from her head through the tent wall. Then, without warning, the bear did something it had not done the previous night. It began to tear at the fabric of their tent with its claws, creating small rips in the waterproof material that let in brief glimpses of the darkness outside. Jacob immediately readied the bear spray, knowing that if the animal breached their shelter, they would have only seconds to defend themselves before being completely at the mercy of one of North America's most powerful predators. "Get ready," he whispered to Emily, though he had no idea what they could possibly do to defend themselves against a grizzly bear in the confines of their small tent. "If it gets through the wall, we're going to have to fight." Emily fumbled for her own canister of bear spray, her hands shaking so badly she could barely maintain her grip on the device. She had practiced using the spray during their pre-trip preparation, but practicing on a calm afternoon with an instructor was vastly different from preparing to deploy it against an actual attacking bear in the middle of the night. The scratching and tearing sounds intensified, and suddenly a massive claw pushed through one of the rips in their tent wall, followed by what appeared to be part of a huge paw as the bear tried to enlarge the opening it had created. Emily bit back a scream of terror as she found herself staring at the actual claw of a grizzly bear just feet away from her face, attached to a paw that looked large enough to kill her with a single swipe. Jacob made a split-second decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of waiting for the bear to fully breach their tent, he aimed his bear spray at the opening where the claw had appeared and discharged a concentrated stream of pepper spray directly at what he hoped was the animal's face and nose. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear let out a roar of pain and surprise that seemed to shake the entire forest around them, immediately withdrawing its paw from their tent and backing away from their shelter, while making sounds of distress and discomfort from the pepper spray contact. "Did you get it?" Emily asked, her voice shaking with fear and adrenaline as the sounds of the bear's distress moved away from their immediate area. "I think so," Jacob replied, though he kept his bear spray ready for another discharge if necessary. "But we need to be ready for it to come back." Bears don't always retreat permanently after being sprayed, especially if they're highly motivated by food or territorial concerns. They listened tensely as the sounds of the bear's distress gradually moved away from their campsite, but neither of them felt any sense of relief or safety. If anything, the knowledge that they had now used their primary defense mechanism against the bear made them feel even more vulnerable and exposed. "We have to get out of here," Emily said, her voice carrying a note of barely controlled panic. "That bear isn't going to give up. It's going to keep coming back until it figures out how to get what it wants, and next time we might not be so lucky." Jacob agreed completely, recognizing that their situation had escalated far beyond the level of normal wildlife encounters that could be managed through standard safety protocols. "We'll pack up at first light and get out of here," he decided. "I don't care about the rest of our honeymoon plans. This has become too dangerous to continue." Neither of them slept for the remainder of the night, taking turns watching the holes that the bear had torn in their tent wall and listening for any sounds that might indicate its return. Jacob used duct tape from their repair kit to patch the worst of the damage, but their shelter had been fundamentally compromised, and they both understood that it would provide little protection if the bear decided to make another determined attempt to gain access. As dawn finally began to brighten the eastern sky, they could see the full extent of the damage to their campsite from the night's encounter. In addition to the tears in their tent, the bear had scattered some of their gear, knocked over their camp chairs, and left clear evidence of its frustration and determination to access whatever had attracted its interest. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to deep claw marks gouged into a tree just a few feet from their tent. "It was right here, probably for hours, trying to figure out how to get to us. We're so lucky that the bear spray worked when it did." Jacob examined the claw marks with growing alarm, recognizing that they indicated a level of persistence and determination that went far beyond normal wildlife behavior. "These marks are fresh from last night," he confirmed. "This bear spent considerable time and energy trying to solve the problem of getting into our camp. That's exactly the kind of escalating behavior that can lead to tragedy." They began breaking camp immediately, working as quickly as possible to pack their gear and prepare for the 8-mile hike back to their vehicle and safety. Emily felt a profound sense of relief as they stuffed their damaged tent into Jacob's backpack and secured the last of their equipment, knowing that each minute they remained in this location increased their risk of another dangerous encounter. "I'm sorry this didn't work out the way we planned," Jacob said as they shouldered their packs and prepared to begin their retreat from what had become a genuinely dangerous situation. "I know how much you were looking forward to spending 5 days here, and I hate that we have to cut our honeymoon short because of safety concerns." Emily turned to look back at Mystic Lake one last time, feeling a complex mixture of sadness, relief, and lingering fear as she took in the spectacular beauty of the location that had nearly become the site of a tragedy. "Don't apologize," she said firmly. "You made the right decisions every step of the way. We came here to have an adventure and create memories together, and we definitely accomplished that, even if it wasn't exactly the kind of adventure we were expecting." As they began hiking down the trail that would take them back to civilization and safety, neither of them could have imagined that their ordeal was far from over, or that the same massive grizzly bear that had terrorized them for 2 nights was at that very moment following their scent trail and preparing to transform their planned retreat into a desperate flight for survival that would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The morning air was crisp and clear as they began their descent from Mystic Lake, both of them feeling a profound sense of relief to be finally leaving the location that had become associated with fear and danger, rather than the romantic wilderness adventure they had originally planned. Emily walked closely behind Jacob, taking comfort in his steady pace and obvious competence in wilderness navigation, while constantly glancing over her shoulder for any signs that they might be followed. "How long do you think it will take us to reach the trailhead?" she asked as they passed the beaver ponds where they had enjoyed lunch just 2 days ago earlier, though it now seemed like weeks since they had felt safe enough to sit and relax in the wilderness. Jacob consulted his GPS unit and topographic map, calculating their hiking time based on their current pace and the fact that they were now traveling downhill with full packs rather than climbing toward their destination. "If we maintain this pace and don't run into any problems, we should reach the parking lot by mid-afternoon," he estimated. "Maybe 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock p.m. at the latest." Emily felt encouraged by the prospect of reaching their vehicle and beginning the drive back towards civilization within a matter of hours. She was already imagining the hot shower and comfortable bed that awaited them at the hotel where they had originally planned to stay only at the end of their camping trip, and she found herself looking forward to simple pleasures like electric lights, running water, and solid walls that no bear could tear through with its claws. They had been hiking for about an hour when Jacob suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence, his expression becoming tense and focused as he listened to something that Emily couldn't immediately identify. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of concern that immediately put her on alert. Emily strained to listen, and after a moment she detected what had caught Jacob's attention, the sound of something large moving through the forest behind them, perhaps a quarter-mile back along the trail they had just traveled. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, suggesting an animal following their route rather than simply moving through its territory on unrelated business. "Is it following us?" Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on Jacob's expression and body language. Jacob continued listening for several more minutes, trying to determine the direction and speed of whatever was making the sounds behind them. "I think so," he finally admitted, his voice grim with the implications of what that might mean for their safety. "The timing and direction are too consistent to be coincidental. Something is definitely moving along our trail, and it's moving faster than we are." Emily felt her heart rate increase as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "The bear?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Almost certainly," Jacob replied, beginning to walk again but at a faster pace than they had been maintaining. "GB-247 has obviously decided that we're part of his routine now, and our leaving the campsite probably just triggered his curiosity about where we're going and what we're doing." The knowledge that they were being followed by a 450-pound predator added a completely new dimension of fear to their retreat from the wilderness. Emily found herself constantly looking back over her shoulder, expecting at any moment to see the massive form of their stalker emerging from the forest behind them. "What should we do?" she asked, working to keep up with Jacob's increased pace while fighting the growing urge to break into a run, despite knowing that running could trigger a chase response from any pursuing predator. Jacob considered their options carefully, drawing on his wilderness experience and his knowledge of bear behavior to formulate a strategy that might allow them to reach safety without provoking a dangerous confrontation. "We need to keep moving, but avoid panicking," he decided. "Bears can easily outrun humans over short distances, so running would only trigger its hunting instincts. Our best bet is to maintain a steady pace, make plenty of noise to let it know we're aware of its presence, and be ready to use our bear spray if it gets too close." They continued hiking at an accelerated pace, periodically calling out, "Hey, bear!" and clapping their hands to announce their presence while listening carefully for any indication that their pursuer was gaining ground on them. The sounds behind them continued, sometimes seeming closer and sometimes more distant, but never disappearing entirely. Emily found herself analyzing every aspect of their situation with the kind of clarity that sometimes emerges during life-threatening circumstances. They were still more than 6 miles from their vehicle and safety, traveling through dense wilderness where help was not available, being followed by a predator that could cover ground much faster than they could if it decided to close the distance between them. "Jake," she said, as they paused briefly at a stream crossing to catch their breath and assess their situation, "what happens if it decides to confront us directly? What if making noise and trying to deter it doesn't work?" Jacob checked his bear spray to make sure it was easily accessible and ready for immediate deployment, while scanning the terrain around them for potential escape routes or defensive positions they could use if necessary. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We use everything we have. Bear spray, rocks, sticks, whatever we can find, and we fight for our lives." Bears can be deterred by aggressive resistance, especially if they're not desperately hungry or defending cubs. The stream crossing required them to focus on their footing and navigation for several minutes, carefully picking their way across slippery rocks while maintaining their balance with heavy packs. Emily found herself terrified that the bear might choose this moment of vulnerability to close the distance between them when they were focused on not falling into the cold mountain water rather than watching for approaching predators. As they completed the crossing and resumed their rapid descent toward the trailhead, the sounds behind them seemed to grow closer and more distinct. Emily could now clearly hear the heavy breathing and occasional grunting that indicated a large animal moving through the forest with considerable exertion, as if it was working to maintain pace with their accelerated hiking speed. "It's getting closer," she said, her voice tight with fear, as she realized that their strategy of maintaining distance through steady hiking was not going to be sufficient to reach safety before their pursuer caught up with them. Jacob could hear it too, the unmistakable sounds of a large bear following their trail and gradually closing the gap between them, despite their best efforts to maintain distance. "We need to change our strategy," he decided. "Let's find a good defensive position and see if we can deter it with aggressive posturing and noise before it gets close enough to force a physical confrontation." They found what Jacob considered an ideal location for a defensive stand. A small clearing where a lightning-struck tree had fallen across the trail, creating both an obstacle that might slow the bear's approach and a platform they could climb onto to gain height advantage if necessary. Large rocks scattered around the clearing provided potential weapons or throwing objects, and the open space would give them room to maneuver and deploy their bear spray effectively. "This is where we make our stand," Jacob announced, dropping his pack and immediately beginning to gather rocks and sticks that could serve as weapons if their bear spray proved insufficient. "Emily, get your bear spray ready and position yourself behind that fallen log. If the bear shows up, we're going to make as much noise as possible and try to convince it that we're more trouble than we're worth." Emily felt her hands shaking as she prepared for what might be a life-or-death confrontation with one of North America's most dangerous predators. She had trained with the bear spray and understood the theory of aggressive defense against bear attacks, but the reality of preparing to fight a 450-pound grizzly bear was almost overwhelming. "What if the spray doesn't work?" she asked, voicing the fear that both of them were trying not to think about. "What if it charges us anyway?" Jacob picked up a substantial piece of deadfall that could serve as a club, testing its weight and balance while keeping his attention focused on the forest around them, where their pursuer would eventually appear. "Then we fight with everything we have," he repeated. "We stay together. We keep spraying until the canisters are empty, and we use rocks and sticks and whatever else we can find. Most bear attacks last only a few seconds, and if we can inflict enough pain and confusion, there's a good chance it will decide we're not worth the effort." The minutes that followed felt like hours, as they waited in their defensive position, listening to the approaching sounds and preparing themselves mentally for what might be about to happen. Emily found herself thinking about their wedding just a week earlier, about all the plans and dreams they had shared for their future together, and about how tragically ironic it would be if their honeymoon adventure ended in disaster just when their life together was beginning. Then, without warning, their pursuer appeared at the edge of the clearing, and Emily's heart nearly stopped as she got her first clear look at the massive grizzly bear that had been stalking them through the wilderness. GB-247 was even larger than she had remembered from their previous sightings, with dark brown fur tipped with silver that gave him his distinctive grizzled appearance, massive shoulders that displayed the incredible muscle mass that made grizzly bears so formidable, and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess them with the kind of calculating intelligence that made him even more dangerous. "There he is," Jacob said quietly, though his voice carried none of the calm confidence he was trying to project. "Remember, no sudden movements, loud voices, and be ready to spray if he gets within 30 feet of us." The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, obviously aware of their presence, but showing no immediate signs of aggression or retreat. Instead, it seemed to be studying them with the kind of focused attention that suggested it was trying to understand exactly what they were and whether they represented a threat, prey, or simply an interesting curiosity in its territory. Emily found herself staring into the eyes of the massive predator, feeling a primitive fear that seemed to reach back through millions of years of human evolution to a time when encounters like this determined who lived and who died. The bear was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a perfect example of the raw power and primal intelligence that had allowed its species to survive and thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. "Hey, bear!" "Ah!" Jacob called out loudly, trying to project confidence and aggression despite the fear coursing through his body. "Get out of here! Go away!" The bear's response was not what either of them expected. Instead of retreating or showing signs of being deterred by Jacob's aggressive posturing, GB-247 actually took several steps closer to their position, his massive head swaying slightly as he tested the air currents for scent information and continued his assessment of the situation. Emily gripped her bear spray with sweating palms, realizing that they were now well within the effective range of the pepper spray, but also uncomfortably close to a predator that could cover the remaining distance between them in a matter of seconds, if it decided to charge. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "it's not backing down." Jacob could see that their initial deterrent strategy was not having the desired effect, and he began to consider more aggressive tactics that might convince the bear to abandon its investigation of their presence. "On the count of 3, we're both going to yell as loud as we can and throw rocks at it," he decided. 1, 2, 3. Both of them let out the loudest, most aggressive shouts they could manage, while simultaneously hurling the largest rocks they could handle toward the bear's position. The rocks didn't hit the animal, but they landed close enough to demonstrate that the humans were willing and able to fight back against any aggressive action. The bear's reaction was immediate and alarming. Instead of being deterred by their aggressive display, GB-247 let out a roar that seemed to shake the forest around them and reared up on his hind legs to his full height, displaying the massive size and obvious power that made grizzly bears one of the most formidable predators in North America. Emily had never heard anything like the sound that erupted from the bear's throat, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to contain all the wildness and danger of the untamed wilderness, a sound that triggered every survival instinct she possessed and made her want to run, despite knowing that running would be exactly the wrong response. "Now!" Jacob shouted, recognizing that the bear's aggressive posturing meant their situation had escalated to a direct confrontation that could only end in retreat by one side or the other. "Spray it now!" Both Emily and Jacob discharged their bear spray canisters simultaneously, creating a cloud of concentrated pepper spray that drifted toward the bear's position on the light mountain breeze. The spray was designed to create a wall of chemical deterrent that would cause immediate pain and discomfort to any animal that contacted it, ideally convincing even the most aggressive predator that retreat was preferable to continuing the confrontation. The effect on GB-247 was dramatic and immediate. The massive bear dropped back to all 4 legs and began making sounds of distress and discomfort as the pepper spray contacted his sensitive nose and eyes, shaking his head violently and pawing at his face in an attempt to relieve the burning sensation. "Did we get him?" Emily asked, though she could clearly see that their defensive strategy had succeeded in causing the bear significant discomfort. "Keep spraying!" Jacob commanded, continuing to discharge his canister toward the bear while reaching for rocks and other projectiles that might reinforce their message that they were prepared to fight. "Don't let up until he retreats." The bear continued to show signs of distress from the pepper spray contact, but instead of immediately retreating, as they had hoped, GB-247 seemed to become angry and more aggressive, letting out another roar and making short, bluff charges toward their position that stopped just short of actually closing the distance between them. Emily felt pure terror as she realized that their primary defensive weapon had succeeded in hurting the bear, but had not deterred its aggressive behavior. If anything, the pain from the pepper spray seemed to have made the massive predator more determined to drive them away from what it apparently considered its territory. "It's not working," she shouted over the bear's continued roars of pain and aggression. The spray isn't making it retreat. Jacob continued throwing rocks while trying to assess their rapidly deteriorating situation. They had used most of their bear spray. The bear was showing increasing aggression rather than retreat, and they were still miles from any help or safety. Their defensive position was good, but it wouldn't protect them if the bear decided to make a full charge rather than the bluff charges it had been making. "Stay behind the log," he commanded, recognizing that their only remaining option might be to try to outlast the bear's aggressive behavior and hope that it would eventually lose interest and move on to other activities. "Keep making noise, keep throwing things, and be ready to climb that tree if it charges us." The confrontation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, with the bear alternating between showing signs of distress from the pepper spray and making aggressive displays that kept both humans in a state of constant terror. Emily found herself wondering if this was how her life was going to end, torn apart by a grizzly bear in a remote wilderness area where her remains might never be found. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the confrontation ended. GB-247 shook his massive head one final time, let out a sound that might have been either frustration or dismissal, and turned away from their position, disappearing back into the forest as quietly as he had appeared. Emily and Jacob remained in their defensive positions for another 20 minutes, afraid to move or relax their vigilance in case the bear was still nearby and might return to continue the confrontation. Only when they were certain that the forest around them had returned to normal sounds and activities did they begin to cautiously gather their scattered gear and prepare to resume their retreat towards safety. "Is it over?" Emily asked, her voice shaking with exhaustion and residual fear as she realized how close they had come to a potentially deadly encounter with one of North America's most dangerous predators. "For now," Jacob replied, though his expression remained tense and alert as he scanned their surroundings for any signs that their adversary might return. "But we need to get out of here immediately. That bear hasn't given up on us. He's just decided to break off this particular engagement. There's no guarantee he won't follow us again or try a different approach." They resumed their hike toward the trailhead at an even faster pace than before, both of them driven by the knowledge that they had narrowly survived one confrontation, but were still miles from safety in an environment dominated by a predator that had demonstrated considerable interest in their presence and activities. Emily found herself unable to stop thinking about the intelligence she had seen in the bear's eyes during their confrontation, the way it had seemed to assess their capabilities and responses, testing their defenses and trying to understand their intentions. This was not the mindless aggression of a simple predator, but the calculated behavior of a highly intelligent animal that was learning about human behavior and possibly developing strategies for future encounters. "Jake," she said, as they descended through the meadows where they had enjoyed such peaceful walks just days earlier, "what if we see other hikers on the trail? What if that bear encounters someone else who doesn't have bear spray or doesn't know how to respond to an aggressive encounter?" Jacob had been worrying about the same possibility, understanding that their encounter with GB-247 had revealed behavioral patterns that posed a significant risk to any humans who might venture into his territory in the future. "We'll have to report everything to the park authorities as soon as we reach the trailhead," he decided. "They need to know that this bear has escalated to direct confrontation with humans and is showing persistent stalking behavior." The remainder of their hike passed without incident, though both of them remained constantly alert for any signs that they were being followed or watched. Emily found herself jumping at every sound, while Jacob maintained a state of hypervigilance that left him exhausted but ready to respond instantly to any new threats. When they finally reached the trailhead parking lot at 3:45 p.m., Emily felt such profound relief that she almost collapsed beside their vehicle. They had successfully escaped from a genuinely life-threatening situation, but the psychological impact of their ordeal was only beginning to register as the adrenaline and fear that had sustained them through their retreat began to fade. "We made it," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face as Jacob unlocked their jeep and they began loading their gear. "I can't believe we actually made it out of there alive." Jacob held her close, feeling his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him as the reality of how close they had come to tragedy began to sink in. "You were incredible, Em," he said softly. "Your courage and quick thinking during that confrontation probably saved both our lives. I'm so proud of how you handled yourself under pressure." As they drove toward the park visitor center to report their encounter to the authorities, neither of them could have imagined that their ordeal had created a situation that would have far-reaching consequences for wilderness safety protocols throughout the North American National Park system, or that their story would become a cautionary tale studied by wildlife managers and wilderness safety experts for years to come. The park visitor center was bustling with afternoon activity when Jacob and Emily arrived to report their encounter with GB-247, their faces still showing the strain and exhaustion of their ordeal, despite their relief at having reached safety. Ranger Patricia Donovan was just finishing her shift when they approached the information desk, and she immediately recognized the young couple she had briefed just 4 days earlier about wilderness safety protocols and bear encounter procedures. "Jacob and Emily Harris," she said with surprise, noting their obvious distress and the fact that they had returned from their planned 5-day camping trip 2 days early. "What brings you back so soon? I hope you didn't encounter any serious problems during your stay at Mystic Lake." Jacob exchanged glances with Emily before responding, both of them still processing the traumatic events of the past 2 days and trying to organize their thoughts enough to provide a coherent account of what they had experienced. "Actually, we did encounter some serious problems," Jacob replied. "We need to report multiple aggressive encounters with what we believe was the grizzly bear you mentioned during our safety briefing, GB-247. Patty's expression immediately became much more serious as she registered the implications of what Jacob was telling her. Aggressive bear encounters involving direct stalking behavior and confrontations with humans were exactly the kind of incidents that required immediate investigation and potentially emergency management actions to protect other wilderness visitors. "Let me get you into a private office where we can discuss this properly," she said, leading them away from the busy public area of the visitor center to a quiet conference room equipped with recording equipment and detailed topographic maps of the park's backcountry areas. "I need to document everything that happened in detail, and depending on what you tell me, we may need to implement immediate safety measures for other campers in that area." Over the next 2 hours, Emily and Jacob provided Patty with a comprehensive account of their experiences at Mystic Lake, starting with their first wildlife sighting of the large grizzly bear on their second day, and progressing through the 2 nights of increasingly aggressive investigations of their campsite, culminating in the direct confrontation during their retreat that had required the use of bear spray and aggressive defensive tactics. Patty took detailed notes and asked probing questions about specific behaviors they had observed, the timing and duration of each encounter, the bear's apparent physical condition and demeanor, and the effectiveness of various deterrent strategies they had employed. Her years of experience in wildlife management had taught her to look for specific behavioral indicators that might suggest a bear was becoming habituated to human presence or developing dangerous associations between humans and food rewards. "The persistence of this bear's interest in your campsite is very concerning," she admitted as she reviewed her notes. "Normal bear behavior would involve a brief investigation followed by avoidance of human presence." The fact that GB-247 returned to your camp on multiple nights and escalated to direct manipulation of your tent suggests we're dealing with a potentially dangerous situation. Emily shuddered as she remembered the sound of the bear's claws tearing through their tent fabric and the sight of its massive paw pushing through the opening it had created. "It wasn't just investigating," she said. "It was problem-solving, trying to figure out how to get to us. There was an intelligence in its behavior that was almost more frightening than its size and strength." Patty nodded grimly, understanding exactly what Emily meant and recognizing the behavioral pattern she was describing as one of the most dangerous scenarios wildlife managers dealt with, a large predator that had lost its natural fear of humans and was beginning to view them as either potential prey or competitors for resources. "The stalking behavior you described during your hike out is particularly troubling," she continued. "Bears that follow humans for extended distances are displaying hunting behavior, which represents a significant escalation from normal territorial or curiosity-driven encounters. Combined with the direct confrontation and the bear's failure to retreat immediately when challenged, we're looking at a pattern that suggests GB-247 may need to be relocated or possibly even destroyed for public safety." Jacob felt a complex mixture of emotions at Patty's words: relief that the authorities were taking their encounter seriously and implementing appropriate safety measures, but also sadness at the possibility that the magnificent animal they had encountered might have to be killed because of behaviors that were ultimately the result of human encroachment into its natural habitat. "Is there any chance the bear could be relocated instead of destroyed?" he asked, understanding the tragic irony that an animal's success in adapting to human presence often led to its death when that adaptation was perceived as threatening to human safety. Patty considered the question carefully, weighing the various factors that would influence any management decision regarding GB-247's future. "Relocation is possible, but it's expensive, logistically challenging, and not always successful," she explained. "Bears have strong sight fidelity and often try to return to their original territory, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles. And if a bear has developed aggressive behaviors toward humans, relocation may just move the problem to a different area where other people could be at risk." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Michael Chang, the park's senior wildlife biologist, who'd been called in to assess the situation based on Patty's preliminary report. Dr. Chang was a 45-year-old research scientist who had spent his entire career studying large predator behavior and management in North American wilderness areas, and his expertise was regularly sought by park systems throughout the continent when dealing with complex human-wildlife conflict situations. "I understand you've had some significant encounters with one of our grizzly bears," Dr. Chang said as he joined the discussion, pulling out his own notebook and digital recording equipment. "Ranger Donovan has briefed me on the basic situation, but I'd like to hear your account directly, particularly focusing on the specific behaviors you observed and any factors that might have triggered or escalated the encounters." Emily and Jacob repeated their story for Dr. Chang, providing even more detailed descriptions of the bear's behavior patterns, body language, and apparent decision-making processes during each encounter. Dr. Chang listened intently, occasionally asking specific questions about timing, environmental conditions, or the bear's apparent physical condition and health status. "Based on your descriptions, particularly the systematic investigation of your campsite and the stalking behavior during your retreat, I'm confident we're dealing with a bear that has developed problematic associations with human activity," Dr. Chang concluded. "The question now is whether these behaviors represent a temporary response to specific circumstances or a more permanent behavioral change that poses an ongoing threat to visitor safety." Patty consulted her computer database of recent wildlife incidents and bear sightings, looking for patterns that might help explain GB247's recent behavior. We've had 3 other reports of bear encounters in the Mystic Lake area over the past month, she reported. 2 involved black bears that showed normal avoidance behavior, but there was 1 report of a large grizzly investigating a campsite about 2 weeks ago. The campers involved didn't report any aggressive behavior, but they did mention that the bear seemed unusually bold and unafraid of human presence. Dr. Chang made notes about the previous encounters, understanding that bear behavior problems often developed gradually over time, as individual animals learn to associate human activities with potential food rewards or territorial advantages. We need to implement immediate closure of the Mystic Lake area to overnight camping, he decided, and I want to organize a field team to go in and assess GB247's current behavior and physical condition firsthand. Emily felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that their report was being taken seriously and that immediate action was being taken to protect other wilderness visitors from potentially dangerous encounters. "Will you be able to determine what caused the behavioral change?" she asked, her scientific training making her curious about the underlying factors that might have triggered the bear's aggressive behavior. "There are several possibilities," Dr. Chang explained. "Food conditioning from previous human encounters is the most common cause, but we also see behavioral changes related to territorial disputes with other bears, seasonal food scarcity, injury or illness, or even genetic factors that make some individuals more bold or aggressive than typical for their species." The discussion continued for another hour as park officials developed a comprehensive response plan that included immediate area closures, enhanced safety warnings for other backcountry areas, deployment of a field research team to locate and assess GB247, and coordination with regional wildlife management agencies that might be involved in any relocation or removal decisions. "We'll also need to prepare a detailed incident report for our regional office and the National Park Service headquarters," Patty explained. "Encounters like this are taken very seriously at the highest levels of park management, and there may be implications for wilderness camping policies throughout the entire park system." As Emily and Jacob finally prepared to leave the visitor center and begin their journey home, both of them felt a complex mixture of emotions about their abbreviated honeymoon adventure. The terror and trauma of their encounters with GB247 would undoubtedly affect them for months or years to come, but they also felt a sense of accomplishment and pride in having survived a genuinely life-threatening situation through their preparation, teamwork, and determination. "Thank you for taking this so seriously," Emily said to Patty and Dr. Chang as they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart. "I know our story might sound exaggerated or sensationalized, but every detail we've told you is exactly what we experienced. That bear was unlike anything I ever imagined we might encounter in the wilderness." Patty shook hands with both of them, her expression conveying both professional appreciation for their detailed reporting and personal sympathy for the traumatic experience they had endured. "You handled yourselves extremely well under very difficult circumstances," she assured them. "Your detailed observations and quick thinking during the actual encounters probably prevented a tragedy, and your willingness to report everything in detail will help us protect other visitors from similar situations." As they drove away from Banff National Park, Emily found herself looking back at the mountain peaks that had been the backdrop for both the most beautiful and most terrifying experiences of her life. Their honeymoon had certainly been memorable and had tested their relationship in ways they never could have anticipated, but it had also demonstrated their ability to work together as a team when facing genuine danger. "I still love the wilderness," she said to Jacob as they drove through the gathering twilight toward their hotel in Calgary. What happened with that bear doesn't change my appreciation for wild places and wildlife, but I definitely have a much deeper understanding now of what it means to be a visitor in someone else's territory. Jacob reached over to take her hand, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude that they had both survived their ordeal and could now begin processing the emotional and psychological impact of their experience. "I'm so proud of you, Em," he said softly. "Your courage and clear thinking during those encounters were incredible. I couldn't have asked for a better partner to face something like that with." Neither of them could have known that their story was about to become much more complicated and tragic, or that GB-247's behavioral problems would escalate into exactly the kind of deadly encounter that wildlife managers most feared. The decision to close the Mystic Lake area had been made too late to prevent one final tragedy that would transform their survival story into a cautionary tale about the complex and often dangerous relationships between humans and wildlife in North America's remaining wilderness areas. 3 days after Jacob and Emily Harris reported their harrowing encounters with grizzly bear GB-247 to park authorities, the first snow of early autumn began falling in the high country around Mystic Lake, dusting the peaks with white and triggering the natural instincts that drove bears to increase their feeding activity in preparation for winter hibernation. Dr. Michael Chang and his wildlife research team had been camped in the area for 2 days, using remote cameras and tracking equipment to locate and assess the behavioral patterns of the problematic bear. But they had found no trace of GB-247 since beginning their field investigation. "It's like he's just vanished," reported Sarah Martinez, a 29-year-old wildlife tracking specialist who had spent the past 8 years working with large predators throughout the Canadian Rockies. "We've found plenty of sign indicating recent bear activity in the area, but nothing that matches the size and track patterns we're looking for from GB-247. Dr. Chang studied the topographic maps spread across their field table, considering the various possibilities that might explain the bear's apparent disappearance from an area where it had shown such persistent interest just days earlier. He could have moved to higher elevations following seasonal food sources, he speculated, or he might have expanded his territory in response to territorial pressure from other bears. Grizzlies can cover enormous distances very quickly when they're motivated by food, territory, or breeding opportunities. Merubit. The research team's camp was located about half a mile from the site where Jacob and Emily had experienced their terrifying encounters, positioned to provide optimal observation opportunities while maintaining safety protocols for working in active bear habitat. Their equipment included motion-activated trail cameras, GPS tracking devices, tranquilizer guns for emergency bear immobilization, and comprehensive communication gear that kept them in constant contact with park headquarters. "We should expand our search grid to include the Whitewater Creek drainage and the high alpine areas north of the lake," suggested Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife veterinarian whose expertise in bear physiology and behavior had made her one of the most respected large carnivore specialists in North America. If GB-247 is following seasonal food patterns, he would likely be moving toward areas with late-season berry concentrations or salmon runs. Dr. Chang agreed with the recommendation, understanding that their window of opportunity for locating and assessing the bear was limited by both changing weather conditions and the approaching hibernation season that would soon drive GB-247 to seek a suitable denning site in preparation for winter. "Let's split into 2 teams," he decided. "Sarah and I will work the northern drainage, while Jennifer and Tom check the alpine areas above the lake." Tom Bradley, a 32-year-old park ranger whose 6 years of backcountry experience had given him intimate knowledge of the park's most remote areas, gathered his tracking equipment and prepared for what might be a challenging search through terrain that became increasingly difficult as winter weather moved into the high country. "I've got reports of fresh bear sign near the old mining road, about 3 miles north of here," he reported. "Could be worth investigating as a starting point." As the research teams prepared to expand their search for GB247, neither Dr. Chang nor his colleagues could have imagined that the bear they were seeking was at that very moment stalking another group of wilderness visitors who had ignored the area closure warnings and were setting up an illegal campsite less than 2 miles from where Jacob and Emily had experienced their terrifying encounters just days earlier. Marcus Thompson, a 26-year-old adventure photographer from Vancouver, had convinced his girlfriend Jessica Chen, a 24-year-old graphic designer, to join him for what he promised would be an incredible opportunity to photograph autumn colors and wildlife in one of Canada's most spectacular wilderness areas. Marcus had built a modest following on social media by posting dramatic photographs of himself in remote and often dangerous locations, and he saw the temporary closure of the Mystic Lake area as an opportunity to capture unique images without dealing with crowds of other photographers and tourists. The closure is probably just bureaucratic overreaction to some minor bear sighting, Marcus had argued when Jessica expressed concerns about ignoring the official warnings. "We've got bear spray, we know how to camp safely, and we'll only be here for 1 night. The photos I get from this trip could really help build my professional portfolio." Jessica had reluctantly agreed to the adventure, trusting Marcus's outdoor experience despite her own reservations about violating park regulations and potentially putting themselves at risk. She was an experienced hiker and camper, but her cautious nature made her uncomfortable with the idea of ignoring official safety warnings, especially those related to dangerous wildlife encounters. They had reached their chosen camping location just before sunset, hiking in from an alternate trailhead to avoid detection by park rangers who might be monitoring the main Cascade Trail access point. Marcus selected a site that offered spectacular views of the lake and surrounding peaks, perfect for the sunrise photography session he had planned for the following morning. "This is incredible," Jessica admitted as they worked together to set up their lightweight tent in a meadow overlooking the pristine alpine lake. "I can see why you wanted to photograph this area. The light on those peaks is absolutely magical." Marcus was already unpacking his camera equipment, testing different lenses and planning the compositions he wanted to capture as the evening light created dramatic shadows and colors across the mountainous landscape. "Tomorrow morning is going to be perfect," he said with satisfaction. "The weather forecast shows clear skies, and with this fresh snow on the peaks, the contrast is going to be spectacular." As darkness settled over their illegal campsite, neither Marcus nor Jessica was aware that they were being watched from the forest surrounding their meadow by an enormous grizzly bear whose behavioral patterns had already brought him into dangerous conflict with humans. GB247 had been attracted to their location by the food odors associated with their evening meal preparation, and his previous encounters with the Harris couple had taught him that human campsites represented interesting opportunities for investigation and potential food rewards. The bear approached their campsite with the patient, methodical behavior that had characterized his stalking of Jacob and Emily, moving quietly through the forest while using his highly developed senses of smell and hearing to gather information about these new visitors to his territory. Unlike his previous encounters, however, GB247 was now dealing with campers who had no knowledge of his recent behavioral problems and were not maintaining the heightened security protocols that might have given them advance warning of his approach. Marcus and Jessica had prepared a simple dinner using their lightweight camping stove, eating by headlamp while discussing their plans for the following day's photography session. They followed basic wilderness camping protocols by securing their food in bear-proof containers, but their food storage system was located much closer to their tent than recommended safety guidelines suggested, and they had not taken the extra precautions that might have been appropriate for camping in an area with known bear activity problems. "Listen to that silence," Jessica said, as they finished cleaning their dishes and prepared to enjoy a brief campfire before retiring to their tent. "It's so different from the city. No traffic, no sirens, no mechanical sounds at all, just the wind in the trees and the water lapping against the shore." Marcus was already planning his morning photography session, studying the terrain around their campsite and visualizing the images he wanted to create when the sunrise light hit the snow-covered peaks. "I'm going to get up before dawn and position myself on that ridge above the lake," he said, pointing toward a rocky outcrop that would provide elevated views of the surrounding landscape. The light should be perfect around 6:30 or 7 a.m. As they settled into their sleeping bags shortly after 10 p.m., neither of them had any awareness of the massive predator that was at that moment investigating the perimeter of their campsite, following scent trails and testing the air currents for information about their activities and potential food sources. GB-247's approach was silent and patient, reflecting the hunting instincts that had been honed by millions of years of predator evolution. The bear's first investigation of their campsite was similar to his initial encounters with Jacob and Emily, a careful, systematic examination of their camping area, food storage system, and tent, conducted with the kind of methodical intelligence that had made him such a formidable and persistent threat to human campers in his territory. Marcus woke first, around 2:30 a.m., to what he initially thought was the sound of wind moving through the trees around their campsite. But as he became more fully awake, he realized that the sounds were too regular and purposeful to be caused by natural wind patterns, and he began to suspect that they might be dealing with some kind of wildlife visitor. "Jess," he whispered quietly, reaching over to gently shake Jessica's shoulder. "I think there's something outside our tent." Jessica came awake immediately, her natural caution making her instantly alert to potential danger situations. "What kind of sounds?" she asked, keeping her voice as quiet as possible while straining to listen to whatever had awakened Marcus. Before Marcus could respond, they both heard it clearly. The distinctive huffing and sniffing sounds that could only be made by a large bear conducting a close investigation of their campsite. The sounds were coming from multiple directions, suggesting that the animal was moving around their tent in a systematic pattern that Marcus recognized from wildlife documentaries as typical predator behavior. "Bear," Marcus breathed, his casual confidence about wilderness camping suddenly evaporating as he realized they were facing exactly the kind of situation that had prompted the area closure warnings they had chosen to ignore. "There's a bear investigating our camp." Jessica felt her heart rate spike as the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were alone in a remote wilderness area, camped illegally in a location that had been closed specifically because of dangerous bear activity, with no way to call for help and no immediate escape routes if the situation escalated to a direct confrontation. "What should we do?" she whispered, reaching for the bear spray that she kept beside her sleeping bag while trying to remember everything she had learned about proper responses to bear encounters during camping trips. Marcus was also fumbling for his bear spray, cursing himself for his overconfidence in dismissing the area closure warnings and putting both of them at risk for the sake of some photographs that suddenly seemed much less important than their immediate safety. "Stay calm and don't make any sudden movements," he replied, though his own voice was shaking with fear. Maybe it will investigate and move on like they usually do. But GB-247's behavior was far from typical for a wild bear encountering human campers. His previous encounters with Jacob and Emily had taught him that human tents contained interesting occupants who could be intimidated and manipulated, and his investigation of Marcus and Jessica's campsite quickly escalated beyond the brief examination that might be expected from a truly wild animal. The bear began pushing against their tent with increasing force and persistence, testing the strength of the fabric and the stability of the structure, while making the deep huffing and grunting sounds that indicated high levels of interest and possibly growing aggression. Marcus and Jessica could smell the wild, musky odor of the massive animal just inches away from them, separated only by the thin nylon fabric of their tent. "It's trying to get in," Jessica whispered in terror as the wall of their tent bulged inward under the pressure of the bear's investigation. Just like those people in the incident report mentioned, it's not just investigating, it's trying to figure out how to get to us. Marcus realized with growing horror that they were experiencing exactly the same kind of escalating encounter that had been described in the incident reports that had led to the area closure. GB-247 was not behaving like a normal wild bear that would investigate briefly and then move on, but like a predator that had learned to view human campers as either potential prey or competitors for resources. "We need to try to scare it away," Marcus decided, though his voice carried little confidence as he prepared to confront a 450-pound predator with nothing more than pepper spray and whatever makeshift weapons they could improvise from their camping equipment. "On the count of 3, we'll yell as loud as we can and start making noise." But before they could implement their defensive strategy, GB-247 did something that transformed their terrifying encounter into a deadly attack. Instead of continuing his external investigation of their tent, the massive bear began tearing at the fabric with his claws, creating large rips that quickly expanded into openings large enough for him to force his way into their shelter. "He's coming through!" Jessica screamed as she saw the bear's massive head and shoulders pushing through the opening he had created in their tent wall. The sight of the enormous predator forcing his way into their shelter triggered every survival instinct she possessed, and she began scrambling toward the opposite side of the tent while fumbling desperately for her bear spray. Marcus deployed his pepper spray immediately, discharging the entire contents of his canister directly at the bear's face and eyes in a desperate attempt to halt the attack before GB-247 could fully enter their tent. The spray had some effect, causing the bear to pause and shake his head violently, but instead of retreating, the pain and confusion seemed to make him more aggressive and determined to continue his assault. GB-247 let out a roar of pain and rage that seemed to shake the entire forest around them, a sound so primal and terrifying that both Marcus and Jessica felt their rational thought processes shutting down as pure survival instinct took over their responses. The bear pushed the rest of the way into their collapsed tent, his massive bulk destroying the lightweight shelter and leaving both humans completely exposed and vulnerable. Jessica managed to discharge her own bear spray, but the confined space of the collapsed tent made it difficult to aim effectively, and much of the spray dissipated without reaching the bear's sensitive areas. She found herself trapped beneath the tent fabric with a 450-pound predator just feet away from her, thrashing around in pain and confusion from the pepper spray while still showing clear, aggressive intent toward the humans who had caused his discomfort. Marcus tried to crawl away from the bear's immediate vicinity, but GB-247's attention focused on him as the source of the painful pepper spray attack. The bear's massive paw struck Marcus in the chest with devastating force, crushing ribs and driving the air from his lungs, while simultaneously opening deep lacerations from the animal's razor-sharp claws. "Marcus!" Jessica screamed as she saw her boyfriend being attacked by the massive predator, his body ragdoll limp under the bear's assault. She continued trying to use her bear spray, but GB-247 seemed to have moved beyond the point where chemical deterrents could stop his attack, driven by a combination of pain, anger, and predatory instincts that had been triggered by the human's defensive actions. The attack that followed was swift and brutal, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, but resulting in injuries that were immediately fatal for both victims. GB-247's size, strength, and predatory capabilities were simply overwhelming when deployed against humans who had no effective means of defense once their pepper spray had failed to deter his aggression. Marcus died first, from massive trauma caused by the bear's claws and teeth, his body unable to withstand the devastating damage inflicted by one of North America's most powerful predators. Jessica survived long enough to understand what was happening to her, but her own injuries were equally severe and beyond any possibility of medical intervention, even if help had been immediately available. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes from the time GB-247 first breached their tent until both victims had sustained fatal injuries. The bear remained in the immediate area for another hour, investigating the campsite and the bodies with the kind of methodical thoroughness that suggested he was learning from each encounter with human campers and possibly developing more sophisticated hunting strategies. When GB-247 finally left the scene of the attack, he dragged both bodies approximately half a mile from the original campsite to a secluded location near a small creek, where he buried them under brush and debris in the classic caching behavior that predators use to protect food sources from scavengers. The shredded remains of their tent and sleeping bags were scattered throughout the meadow where they had set up their illegal campsite, creating a scene of devastation that would haunt the first responders who eventually discovered it. The discovery of the attack site came 3 days later when Dr. Chang's research team expanded their search for GB-247 to include the drainage where Marcus and Jessica had been camping. Sarah Martinez was the first to spot the scattered camping equipment and immediately recognized the signs of a catastrophic bear attack, calling for immediate backup and emergency response teams while securing the scene to preserve evidence for the investigation that would follow. "We've got a fatality scene," she radioed to Dr. Chang, her voice shaking despite her years of experience with wildlife incidents. "Multiple victims. Looks like a grisly attack. The campsite is completely destroyed, and there are clear signs that the bodies were dragged from the original attack location." Dr. Chang's response was immediate and comprehensive, involving park rangers, RCMP investigators, forensic specialists, and emergency medical personnel who were flown to the scene by helicopter to begin the grim process of recovering the victims' remains and documenting the evidence that would be used to understand exactly what had happened during the attack. The investigation that followed revealed that Marcus Thompson and Jessica Chen had ignored area closure warnings and camped illegally in habitat where GB-247 had already demonstrated dangerous behavioral patterns toward human visitors. Their deaths represented exactly the kind of tragedy that wildlife managers had feared when they learned about the bear's escalating aggression and persistent stalking behavior. "This is what we were trying to prevent," Dr. Chang told the assembled media representatives during a press conference held the day after the bodies were recovered. "Area closures aren't arbitrary bureaucratic decisions. They're implemented specifically to protect human life when we identify wildlife behavior. Patterns that pose genuine threats to visitor safety. The deaths of Marcus Thompson and Jessica Chen transformed the story of Jacob and Emily Harris's survival into a much larger conversation about wilderness safety, human-wildlife conflict, and the complex challenges facing wildlife managers in an era of increasing human encroachment into traditional predator habitat. The tragedy also sparked intense debate about the balance between preserving wilderness access for outdoor recreation and protecting both human visitors and wildlife from dangerous encounters. GB-247 was located and destroyed by wildlife authorities 6 days after the attack, ending the immediate threat he posed to other wilderness visitors, but raising difficult questions about the factors that had transformed a magnificent wild animal into a deadly threat to human safety. The necropsy performed on the bear revealed no signs of disease or injury that might have explained his aggressive behavior, suggesting that his dangerous habits had developed through learned associations between human activity and potential rewards. The investigation into the deaths of Marcus Thompson and Jessica Chen revealed that they had been aware of the area closure but had chosen to ignore the warnings in order to pursue Marcus's photography goals. Their decision to camp illegally in a location that had been specifically closed because of dangerous bear activity ultimately cost them their lives and created a tragedy that would have lasting impacts on wilderness recreation policies throughout the North American park system. Emily Harris learned about the deaths through news coverage that identified them as victims of the same bear that had stalked her and Jacob during their honeymoon camping trip. The knowledge that GB-247 had escalated from stalking and intimidation to actual killing left her with complex feelings of survivor guilt, relief, and profound sadness for the young couple whose adventure had ended in tragedy. "It could have been us," she told Jacob as they watched news coverage of the incident from the safety of their home in Colorado. "If we had made different decisions, if we hadn't had bear spray, if we hadn't been as prepared as we were, it could have been our bodies being recovered from that meadow." Jacob held her close, understanding exactly what she meant, and feeling his own complex emotional responses to learning that their survival story had become connected to a much larger tragedy involving other people who had been less fortunate in their encounter with the same dangerous predator. "But it wasn't us," he reminded her gently. "We followed safety protocols. We reported the encounters promptly. And we made the difficult decision to leave when the situation became too dangerous. Their deaths are tragic, but they don't diminish the courage and good judgment you showed during our own encounters." The story of GB-247 and his victims became a case study in human-wildlife conflict that was examined by researchers, wildlife managers, and safety experts throughout North America. The deaths of Marcus Thompson and Jessica Chen served as a tragic reminder that wilderness recreation, no matter how carefully planned and executed, always involves some level of risk when humans venture into habitat dominated by large predators whose behavior can be unpredictable and potentially deadly. For Jacob and Emily Harris, their survival of multiple encounters with GB-247 became a defining experience that deepened their appreciation for wilderness environments, while also giving them a profound respect for the very real dangers that existed in places where humans were visitors rather than masters of the landscape. Their honeymoon adventure had tested their relationship in ways they never could have anticipated, but it had also demonstrated their ability to work together as a team when facing genuine, life-threatening challenges. "I still want to go back to places like that," Emily told Jacob months later as they planned their first wilderness camping trip since their terrifying experience at Mystic Lake. "What happened with that bear doesn't change my love for wild places and wildlife, but I definitely have a much deeper understanding now of what it means to be a visitor in someone else's territory and the importance of respecting both the beauty and the danger that comes with true wilderness experiences. The legacy of their encounter with GB247 would influence their approach to wilderness recreation for the rest of their lives, making them more cautious and better prepared, but also more appreciative of the incredible privilege of experiencing some of the last truly wild places left on Earth. Their story became part of the larger narrative of human-wildlife coexistence in an era when such encounters were becoming increasingly rare and precious, even when they carried the potential for tragedy.